At the annual Mitchell Manufacturing Company picnic, my father stood in front of our employees, business partners, and family friends, and called me worthless. He handed my innovative designs, the ones that could save his failing company, to my brother, then told me to clear out my office and never come back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What my father didn't realize was that I'd already secured the financing to buy him out. 7 days later, I walked into the boardroom he built, sat in his chair, and watched as security escorted him from the building. My name is Olivia Mitchell, and this is how I went from being disowned to becoming CEO. The morning of the company picnic dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect Ohio summer days where the humidity takes a rare break and the air feels almost crisp. Mitchell Manufacturing had held this event at Lakewood Park for 37 years straight. My grandfather started the tradition, and my father, Richard, continued it with religious devotion, though that was about the only tradition of my grandfather's that he respected. I arrived earlier than necessary, not from excitement, but from habit. Punctuality was the Mitchell family religion, preached by my father with the fervor of a true believer. Early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable, he'd say, checking his watch with a scowl that could curdle milk. So I pulled into the empty parking lot at 9:15 a.m. for an 11:00 a.m. event, my car loaded with the presentation materials I'd spent the last 6 months perfecting. The pavilion stood empty, picnic tables arranged in neat rows, waiting for the blue and gray tablecloths that matched our company colors. I set my materials down at the head table, the one reserved for family and executives, and began arranging my folders. Inside each one, a comprehensive plan to modernize Mitchell Manufacturing's outdated production systems, complete with cost projections, timeline, and projected revenue increases. This wasn't just any proposal. This was the culmination of my engineering degree, my MBA, and 5 years working my way up from the shop floor. It was the roadmap that could save our family business from the slow death it was experiencing at the hands of cheaper overseas competitors and my father's stubborn refusal to innovate. As I lined up the folders precisely, another habit instilled. By Richard Mitchell, a familiar voice called out from behind me. Always the first to arrive, aren't you, Liv? I turned to see Nathan, my older brother, strolling toward me with his signature easy confidence. Unlike me, Nate had never worked a day on the production floor. He'd gone straight from business, school to a corner office, his path smoothed by our father's unshakable belief that his son was the natural heir to the Mitchell legacy. Someone has to be, I replied, forcing a smile. Despite everything, I'd never been able to hate Nate. He was a product of our father's making just as much as I was, molded by expectations rather than earning his position. Those the modernization plans? He asked, gesturing to my meticulously prepared folders. I nodded. Dad agreed to give me 15 minutes during the announcements. It's our best shot at staying competitive. Nate's smile faltered just enough for me to notice. Right. About that. Dad wanted me to tell you there's been a change in the program. He's going to focus on the new client announcements instead. The familiar sting of disappointment pierced my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. Nate, these plans aren't optional anymore. We lost the Westridge contract last month. Precision Toolworks is automating and cutting their prices by 20%. If we don't adapt— I know, he interrupted, raising his hands in surrender. I'm just the messenger. Talk to Dad when he gets here. But I knew how that conversation would go. The same way it had gone every time I'd tried to drag Mitchell Manufacturing into the 21st century. Richard Mitchell didn't believe in change, especially when suggested by his daughter. By 10:30, the pavilion had transformed. Employees and their families began to arrive, carrying potluck dishes and wearing the company-issued T-shirts distributed the week before. I recognized faces from every department, people whose livelihoods depended on decisions made in my father's wood-paneled office. People who would lose everything if we continued on our current path. My mother appeared at my elbow, elegant as always in a tailored blue dress that matched the company colors perfectly. Diane Mitchell was nothing if not on brand. "Olivia, darling," she said, air-kissing near my cheek. "You look tired. Have you been sleeping?" "I've been working, Mom. The modernization proposal." "Oh, that." She waved a dismissive hand. "Your father mentioned something about that. He thinks it's premature." Premature? The word landed like a slap. We were hemorrhaging clients, operating machinery from the 1990s, and losing skilled workers to more innovative competitors. There was nothing premature about addressing a crisis that had been building for years. "We're going bankrupt, Mom," I said quietly, keeping my voice low to avoid being overheard by the arriving guests. "Dad can ignore it all he wants, but the numbers don't lie." My mother's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Your father has been running this company since before you were born, Olivia. He knows what he's doing." Before I could respond, a ripple of attention moved through the crowd. Richard Mitchell had arrived, commanding the space as he always did. At 62, my father still cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from decades of being the unquestioned authority in every room. He moved through the gathering, like a politician, shaking hands and clapping shoulders, his booming laugh echoing across the pavilion. I watched as employees straightened their posture when he approached, their expressions shifting to careful neutrality. Everyone knew Richard Mitchell's approval was conditional, his disappointment swift and merciless. I clutched my presentation folder tighter as he made his way toward the family table. When he reached us, he greeted my mother with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, clasped Nate's hand warmly, and then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Olivia, right on time as usual." "Actually, I've been here since 9, I replied. He checked his watch, the vintage Rolex my grandfather had given him when he took over the company. "Eager to get started, I see. Nate tells me you've prepared some kind of presentation." "The modernization plan we discussed," I said, offering him one of the folders. "I've updated the projections based on last quarter's numbers." He didn't take the folder. Instead, he looked past me to where the company's board members were beginning to gather. "We'll see if there's time for that today. I've got some important announcements to make first." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the feeling I'd had since childhood whenever my father dismissed my efforts without even looking at them. But I was no longer the little girl who had brought home perfect report cards only to have them glanced at and set aside with a distracted, "That's what we expect from a Mitchell." "Dad, we need to talk about this now," I insisted, lowering my voice. "The company is in trouble. These plans could save us millions in production costs and open up new markets. We can't afford to wait." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, perhaps recognition of the truth in my words. But then his jaw set in the stubborn expression I knew all too well. "I've been hearing about trouble since the oil crisis in the 70s, he said dismissively. "Mitchell Manufacturing has weathered worse storms than a few lost contracts." "Not like this," I pressed. "Our production costs are 30% higher than our competitors. Our equipment is obsolete. The modernization plan—" "Enough," he cut me off, his voice sharp enough to draw glances from nearby tables. "This is a company celebration, not a board meeting. We'll discuss your concerns later." But later never came with Richard Mitchell. It was his favorite way to shelve discussions he didn't want to have, particularly with me. The picnic proceeded, according to the same script it had followed for decades. There were the usual company updates, recognition of employees celebrating work anniversaries, and announcement of the quarterly performance awards. I sat at the family table, my unopened presentation folders mocking me from beside my plate of barely touched potato salad. Then came the moment that changed everything. My father tapped his glass with a spoon, commanding attention from the gathered crowd. Before we wrap up today, I have an important announcement regarding the future of Mitchell Manufacturing. I straightened in my seat. Perhaps he'd reconsidered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Perhaps the gravity of our financial situation had finally penetrated his stubborn certainty. As many of you know, he continued, manufacturing has faced increasing challenges in recent years. Foreign competition, changing markets, technological shifts. Heads nodded throughout the audience. These weren't abstract concepts to the people who worked our production lines. Some believe the answer is to abandon our traditions and chase every new trend that comes along, my father said, and I felt his glance slide toward me like a cold draft. But Mitchell Manufacturing wasn't built on chasing trends. It was built on reliability, craftsmanship, and staying true to what we know works. The knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't leading where I'd hoped. That's why today, I'm announcing a strategic refocusing of our company's direction, he declared. We're doubling down on what we do best. High-quality, American-made components crafted by skilled hands, not computers. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I could see confusion on many faces, particularly among the younger employees who understood exactly how out of step this approach was with industry realities. To lead this initiative, my father continued, I'm appointing Nathan Mitchell as our new Chief Strategy Officer. Nate looked as surprised as I felt, his eyes widening slightly before he composed himself and rose to stand beside our father. Nathan will be overseeing a comprehensive review of our operations, focusing on strengthening our core product lines and eliminating unnecessary distractions. My father turned then, gesturing to the stack of folders beside me. Which brings me to our final announcement. Effective immediately, the Advanced Technologies Division will be discontinued. The division I had built from nothing over the past 3 years. The only part of Mitchell Manufacturing showing growth instead of decline. Its resources will be reallocated to support our traditional manufacturing processes, my father stated, as if he were announcing nothing more controversial than a change in the company parking policy. I sat frozen, aware of eyes turning toward me from every direction. The Advanced Technologies Division was synonymous with my name within the company. Everyone knew it was my creation, my vision. Sometimes, my father continued, his voice taking on the righteous tone he used when dispensing what he considered wisdom. We need to recognize when certain approaches aren't yielding results, when certain contributions aren't meeting expectations. The pavilion had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the tension crackling in the air. In business, as in life, we must be willing to cut our losses, to recognize when something, or someone, simply isn't working out. He turned to face me directly now, no longer pretending he was addressing the general audience. Olivia, I've given you every opportunity to prove your value to this company. I've funded your pet projects, allowed you to experiment with resources we could ill afford to waste. But the results speak for themselves. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My division had generated the only growth the company had seen in 5 years. We'd secured 3 patents that had the potential to transform our production capabilities. The Advanced Technologies Division has been a drain on our resources and a distraction from our core business, he declared. And your continued insistence on changing what isn't broken demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of what makes this company work. My mother stared fixedly at her plate. Nate looked uncomfortable, but remained silent at my father's side. Therefore, my father said, his voice hard as the steel we manufactured, I've come to a difficult but necessary decision. Olivia, your position at Mitchell Manufacturing is terminated, effective immediately. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Mrs. Patel from accounting covered her mouth in shock. Dave from the machine shop shook his head in disbelief. Your access cards will be deactivated by end of day, my father continued, as if he were discussing a stranger rather than his daughter. HR will send the necessary paperwork regarding your separation package. I sat perfectly still, my face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the earthquake happening inside me. 30 years of seeking this man's approval, of working twice as hard to receive half the recognition, of swallowing criticism and dismissal. All of it crystallized in this moment of public humiliation. This company was built by people who understood value, my father said, addressing the crowd again, but his eyes still fixed on me. Who knew that worth isn't measured by fancy degrees or flashy innovations, but by dedication to fundamentals, by respecting tradition instead of constantly trying to reinvent the wheel. He placed a hand on Nate's shoulder. The future of Mitchell Manufacturing lies in steady hands that understand our legacy, not with those who would risk everything we've built on untested ideas. The implication was unmistakable. My brother was worthy. I was not. My father raised his glass. To Mitchell Manufacturing, to tradition, to a future built on the solid foundation of our past. People lifted their glasses automatically, the habit of deference to Richard Mitchell too ingrained to resist, even in this shocking moment. But the usual enthusiasm was absent, replaced by awkward murmurs and averted eyes. I could have shouted. Could have listed the contracts my division had secured, the efficiency improvements my untested ideas had already delivered, the industry recognition we'd received. Could have pointed out that my father's solid foundation was crumbling beneath our feet while he refused to acknowledge the changing landscape. Instead, I stood slowly, gathering my presentation folders with deliberate care. I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and walked out of the pavilion without a word, my footsteps measured and unhurried. Behind me, I heard my father resume his speech as if nothing extraordinary had happened, his voice carrying across the park. Now then, let's recognize our employees of the quarter. I drove home in perfect silence, the kind that fills your ears with rushing blood and makes your fingertips tingle. Not angry silence, something deeper, cooler, more clarifying. By the time I parked in front of the Tudor-style house I'd grown up in, my mind had achieved a stillness I'd never known before. Inside, I bypassed the grand foyer with its photographs of Mitchell men, my grandfather, my father, even Nate, and headed straight for my bedroom. It hadn't changed much since high school. My father had never seen the point in redecorating a perfectly functional space. I pulled my suitcases from the closet and began to pack methodically. Clothes, books, the awards my father had never displayed, the prototypes of innovations he'd dismissed as unnecessary, the business plan I'd developed 2 years earlier, the one I'd set aside out of loyalty to the family company. I was nearly finished when my phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, who had left the family business decades ago after her own clash with the Mitchell patriarchy. Heard what happened? Meet me at Westlake Cafe in an hour? Carol had always been the family outlier, the one who'd sold her company shares to fund a tech startup in the early 2000s and never looked back. My father called her reckless. She called herself free. On my way, I texted back. I carried my suitcases down to the car, making 3 trips without encountering my mother or anyone else. The house staff, long accustomed to the Mitchell family dynamics, made themselves scarce during times of tension. As I loaded the last bag, I paused to look back at the house where I'd never quite belonged, despite bearing its name. Then I drove away, not yet knowing I would never return as a daughter, only as an owner. Aunt Carol was already waiting when I arrived at Westlake Cafe, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that belied her status as one of Ohio's most successful tech entrepreneurs. At 58, she radiated the confident energy of someone who had built a life entirely on her own terms. "There she is," Carol said, standing to give me a brief, firm hug before we both sat down. "I ordered you that hazelnut latte you like." "Thanks," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "News travels fast." "Harold Bennett called me," she explained. Harold was my father's oldest friend and the one board member who had consistently supported my modernization efforts. He was appalled. They all were, Liv. Even the old guard who usually back your father without question. I nodded, unsurprised. Public humiliation of family members violated even Richard Mitchell's code of conduct, under normal circumstances. That he'd done it anyway suggested something I'd suspected for months. Mitchell Manufacturing was in far worse shape than he was admitting. "What's your next move?" Carol asked, never one for beating around the bush. I took a sip of my latte, organizing my thoughts. "I'm not sure yet. Find an apartment, update my resume." Carol studied me with knowing eyes. "That's the practical stuff. I'm asking about the company, Liv, about what you're going to do with everything you've built. Dad made it pretty clear I don't have a place there anymore." "Richard is an idiot," she said matter-of-factly. "Always has been. Talented in his way, hard-working for sure, but an idiot about the things that really matter, like recognizing that the world has changed since 1985. I couldn't help but smile. Carol had never minced words about my father. "The company's dying," I admitted quietly. "Has been for years. Dad won't admit it, but we've lost 40% of our market share in the last decade. The modernization plan wasn't just about growth, it was about survival." Carol nodded. "I figured as much. Your father's too proud to admit he's running the company into the ground. The board knows. They've been trying to push him toward retirement, but he won't hear of it. Typical Richard. He'd rather the whole ship go down than admit he's not the captain he once was." Carol leaned forward, her expression intent. "But that's not what I asked you, Liv. I asked what you're going to do about it." I shook my head. "What can I do?" "He fired me, very publicly. Which might be the first smart thing he's done in years, though not for the reasons he thinks." Carol pulled out her tablet and tapped the screen a few times before sliding it across the table to me. "Take a look." On the screen was a financial report, Mitchell Manufacturing's latest quarterly filing with the SEC. I was familiar with the document. I'd analyzed it thoroughly while preparing my modernization proposal. But Carol had highlighted something I hadn't focused on: the company's credit position. "They're leveraged to the hilt," she said unnecessarily. I could see the numbers for myself. The loan covenants require them to maintain certain performance metrics they've missed for the last 2 quarters. The bank could call the loans, I murmured, scanning the details. Force a restructuring or even liquidation. Exactly. And from what my contacts in the industry tell me, First Midwestern is getting nervous. They're not going to sit back and watch a 70-year-old company drive itself into insolvency. I looked up from the tablet. "What are you suggesting?" Carol's smile was sharp and sure. "I'm suggesting you stop thinking like Richard Mitchell's daughter and start thinking like the businesswoman you are. The company needs new leadership. The bank wants stability. And you—" She pointed at me with unerring certainty. "You have the vision to turn it around." "The board would never—" "The board is desperate," Carol interrupted. "Harold told me 3 of them approached your father about stepping down last month. He threatened to sell to an overseas competitor out of spite." That sounded exactly like my father. He'd burned down his own legacy before admitting he was wrong. "Even if that's true," I argued, "I don't have the resources to make a play. Dad's made sure of that by keeping my compensation well below market rate." Carol tapped the tablet screen again, bringing up a new document. "You don't, but I do. And so do several investors who've been watching you build that advanced technologies division from nothing." The document was a term sheet, a preliminary offer of financing for an acquisition of Mitchell Manufacturing. The numbers made my breath catch. "This is serious money, Carol." "Damn right it is," she agreed. "I've been putting this together for months, waiting for the right moment. Your father firing you in front of God, and everybody just accelerated the timeline." I stared at her. "You knew this was coming?" I knew something was coming. Richard's too stubborn to change course on his own, and too proud to let anyone else take the wheel. It was only a matter of time before he made a move like this. She shrugged. I just didn't expect him to be quite so public about it. I looked back at the term sheet, my mind racing through implications, possibilities, risks. The bank would have to agree. They will. They'd rather see an orderly transition to competent leadership than a messy foreclosure. The board is fed up with Richard and terrified of bankruptcy. Harold says he can deliver at least 5 votes. You only need 6 for a majority. I fell silent, considering what she was proposing. It wasn't just a business move. It was a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had defined my entire life. The dynamic my father had reinforced just hours ago with his public repudiation. This isn't about revenge, Liv, Carol said softly, reading my thoughts. It's about saving a company that supports 300 families in this community. It's about preserving what's worth preserving and changing what needs to change. She was right. This wasn't about getting back at my father for 3 decades of dismissal and today's final humiliation. It was about the company my grandfather had built, the workers who depended on it, and the potential I could see so clearly while my father remained willfully blind. If we do this, I said slowly, it has to be clean, professional, not a family melodrama. Carol nodded, approving. Absolutely. This is business, not a reality TV show. And Nate? He didn't ask for this situation. He's welcome to stay if he's willing to actually earn his position for once, Carol said. That's your call as CEO. CEO. The title sent a shiver through me, not of ambition, but of responsibility. The weight of 300 livelihoods. The challenge of modernizing a company that had resisted change for decades. I'll need to see the full financing package, I said, and speak with the investors personally. Carol's smile widened. There's the Mitchell I know is in there. I've set up meetings for tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. sharp at my office. And the bank? First Midwestern's VP of Commercial Lending is expecting your call. They're very interested in hearing about your modernization plans. I shook my head, amazed at how thoroughly Carol had prepared. You really have been working on this for months. I've watched you fight to be heard in that company for years, Liv. Watched you develop solutions while Richard created problems. Watched you earn respect while he demanded it. Her expression softened. I wasn't going to let him waste your talent forever. Today, he just made it easier for us to make our move. I took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger or vindication, but clarity. Purpose. All right, I said. Let's do this. The next 7 days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, document reviews, and strategic planning. Carol's network opened doors I hadn't known existed, connecting me with investors eager to back my vision for transforming Mitchell Manufacturing from a struggling traditional factory into a modern, technology-enhanced production facility. The financing came together with surprising speed, largely because the company's precarious position had created urgency among all parties. The bank, facing the prospect of a troubled loan, embraced the opportunity for an orderly transition to leadership with a concrete turnaround plan. The investors, impressed by the innovations I'd already implemented in my division, committed the capital needed to execute a complete modernization. Through it all, I operated in complete secrecy. I rented a small apartment above a bookstore in downtown Lakewood, set up a temporary office in Carol's building, and avoided any contact with my family. My father would learn of my plans only when they were irreversible. On the morning of the 7th day after the company picnic, I dressed with deliberate care in a charcoal gray suit, applied minimal makeup, and pulled my hair back into a simple professional style. This wasn't about making a statement through appearance. The facts would speak loudly enough. At precisely 9 a.m., I walked into the Mitchell Manufacturing headquarters with Carol beside me and 3 members of the investment team following. The receptionist, Jenny, who had started the same year I had, looked up in surprise. Olivia, we didn't expect— your father said. I have a 9:15 appointment with the board, I stated calmly. They should be expecting me. Jenny blinked in confusion. The board? But they're in emergency session this morning. Your father called it yesterday when the bank— She stopped herself, suddenly aware she might be sharing confidential information. When the bank called their loans? I finished for her. Yes, I know. That's why I'm here. Understanding dawned on her face. Oh my goodness. Could you please let them know I've arrived? I asked, maintaining the professional demeanor that would define this entire process. Jenny nodded and picked up her phone, murmuring into it with wide eyes. A moment later, she looked up. They're ready for you. Conference room A. Thank you, Jenny, I said, then turned to my group. This way. We walked through familiar hallways lined with photographs of Mitchell products and milestone moments in company history. Employees stopped and stared as we passed, word of my arrival spreading through the building at lightning speed. I acknowledged them with nods but didn't stop to explain. There would be time for that later. Conference room A was the largest meeting space in the building, with a long mahogany table that had been part of the company since my grandfather's day. When we entered, the room fell silent. 12 people sat around the table. The 9 board members, my father at the head, my brother to his right and Harold Bennett to his left. My father's face darkened with anger when he saw me. What is the meaning of this? You have no authority to be here. Harold spoke before I could respond. Actually, Richard, I invited her. As acting chair of this emergency session, I have that authority. Acting chair? My father nearly sputtered. Since when? Since 20 minutes ago, when the board voted to temporarily relieve you of your duties pending resolution of the financial crisis you've created, Harold replied, his normally genial tone hardened by months of frustration. A crisis, I might add, that Olivia warned us about repeatedly and offered solutions for. My father's face flushed deep red. This is ridiculous. A temporary setback blown out of proportion. The bank has called $17 million in loans, Richard, one of the other. Board members cut in. That's not a temporary setback. That's an extinction-level event if we don't act immediately. I stepped forward then, placing my briefcase on the table. Gentlemen, Ms. Reynolds, I acknowledge the board's sole female member. I believe I can offer a solution. You? My father's laugh was harsh. The solution to decades of business challenges from someone who couldn't even make her little technology experiments profitable? I didn't take the bait. Instead, I opened my briefcase and removed the acquisition proposal we'd finalized at 2 a.m. that morning. I represent a consortium of investors prepared to inject $30 million in capital into Mitchell Manufacturing, resolving the immediate debt crisis and funding the comprehensive modernization program I presented to this board 3 months ago. I distributed copies of the proposal to each board member, deliberately placing my father's copy last. In exchange, the consortium would acquire a controlling interest in the company, with myself assuming the role of chief executive officer and implementing the strategic plan outlined in Section 3. The room erupted in a chaos of voices, questions flying from every direction. I stood calmly at the center of the storm, answering each query with the detailed knowledge that came from years of preparation for exactly this moment. Yes, the bank had already provisionally approved the arrangement. Yes, all current employees would retain their positions during the transition. Yes, the Mitchell family would maintain a minority stake. Yes, production would continue uninterrupted during the modernization process. Throughout the discussion, my father sat rigid with fury, the proposal untouched before him. Nate leafed through his copy with an unreadable expression, occasionally glancing between our father and me. After nearly an hour of questions, Harold called for order. We need to consider this offer carefully. but given the timeline presented, by the bank, we'll need to make a decision today. This is absurd, my father finally exploded, slapping his hand on the table. You're actually considering letting her take over after I built this company into what it is today? What it is today, Harold said quietly, is on the brink of bankruptcy, Richard. And it's there because you refused to listen to the very person who saw the crisis coming and developed a plan to prevent it. She's trying to destroy my legacy. No, Richard, I spoke directly to my father for the first time. I'm trying to save it. The Mitchell name, the jobs, the community presence, everything that actually matters about this company. I turned to address the board. My grandfather built Mitchell Manufacturing to adapt to changing times. My father maintained it by doing what worked in his era. Now, it's time for the company to evolve again. I gestured to the proposal. This plan doesn't erase our heritage. It builds on it. The vote took less than 30 minutes. 7 in favor, 2 abstentions, 0 against. Even with my father and 1 loyal ally abstaining rather than directly opposing, the outcome was decisive. Harold made the formal announcement. By majority vote, the board accepts the acquisition proposal presented by Olivia Mitchell and authorizes the immediate transition of executive leadership. It was done. In the space of a week, I had gone from being publicly fired to becoming the CEO of the company that bore my name. My father stood, his face a mask of cold rage. You'll regret this, all of you. He turned to Nate. Let's go. But my brother hesitated, looking at the proposal still open in front of him. Dad, I think we should at least. Now, Nathan? My father snapped. To my surprise, Nate didn't move. I'm staying, Dad. Someone from the family should be part of this transition. The betrayal in my father's eyes as he looked at his son mirrored what I'd seen in them countless times when I'd failed to meet his impossible standards. Without another word, he stormed toward the door. Mr. Mitchell, I called, stopping him. Before he could exit. Company security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings. He turned slowly, disbelief warring with fury on his face. You're having me escorted out? Like any departing executive. During a leadership transition, I corrected calmly. It's standard procedure, one you've implemented yourself many times. Indeed, 2 security officers were already waiting outside the conference room, not to humiliate him, but to ensure an orderly process during a volatile situation. This company has policies, I continued. I intend to respect them even when they apply to former CEOs. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite respect, but perhaps the first glimmer of recognition that I was not simply the daughter he had dismissed, but a business leader in my own right. Then the moment passed, his expression hardened, and he walked out without another word. I turned back to the board, to my new executive team, to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Now, I said, opening my modernization plan to the first page, let's get to work. 6 months later, Mitchell Manufacturing held an open house to showcase our newly modernized production facility. The old machinery had been replaced with state-of-the-art equipment. The workforce had been retrained rather than replaced. The client list had expanded to include technology sectors we couldn't have approached under the old system. As I walked through the transformed factory floor, greeting employees and demonstrating innovations to visitors, I spotted a familiar figure standing by the entrance. My father, older somehow, less imposing than the man who had loomed so large throughout my life. I approached him directly, extending my hand as I would to any visitor. Thank you for coming, Mr. Mitchell. He took my hand after a moment's hesitation. Quite a transformation, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Would you like a tour? I offered. He nodded silently, and we walked together through the facility he had once ruled. I showed him the new production lines, the automated quality control systems, the advanced materials we were now able to work with. I introduced him to new team members and acknowledged his previous contributions when appropriate. Not once did I mention the picnic, the firing, or the takeover. This wasn't about reopening wounds or seeking validation. It was about showing respect for the company's history while embracing its future. When we reached my office, his former domain, he paused at the threshold. The space had been completely redesigned, open and transparent, where it had once been closed and traditional. "Your grandfather wouldn't recognize the place," he said finally. "Maybe not," I agreed, "but I think he'd recognize the purpose. To build something lasting, something that adapts and grows." My father was quiet for a long moment. "I was wrong," he said at last, the words clearly difficult for him to form. "Not about everything, but about you." Coming from Richard Mitchell, this qualified as a profound apology. I nodded, accepting it for what it was. "Would you like to see what we're planning next?" I asked, gesturing to the digital blueprint displayed on my office wall. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Another time, perhaps. This is enough for today." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "Dad?" He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You built something worth saving," I said simply. A subtle nod, a straightening of his shoulders, and then he was gone. Not the tyrant who had declared me worthless, nor a defeated enemy, but simply a man who had lost his way and was now finding a new one. I returned to my office and looked out the window at the factory floor below. What had begun as a response to rejection had become something else entirely. A reclamation not just of my place in the company, but of the company's place in the future. Mitchell Manufacturing would survive, adapt, and thrive, not despite the Mitchell legacy, but because of its next chapter. The creation of that next chapter wasn't simple or straightforward. The path from that fateful company picnic to the transformed factory was paved with challenges that tested my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. 3 days after the board approved my acquisition, I moved into the CEO's office, my father's domain for 30 years. The space radiated his personality: dark wood paneling, heavy leather furniture, display cases filled with manufacturing awards from decades past. Family photos showed my father with my brother at company events, industry conferences, charity, golf tournaments. I was notably absent from these curated memories, much as I'd been from the company's public image. Rather than immediately redecorating, I left the office untouched those first few weeks. There were more pressing concerns than aesthetics. The company's finances were in worse shape than even I had realized. Behind the carefully maintained facade of stability my father had presented to the world, Mitchell Manufacturing was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. I spent that first weekend buried in financial records, tracing the decline that had accelerated over the past 5 years. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. My father had been artificially propping up the company's performance by depleting reserves, selling off assets, and deferring critical maintenance and upgrades. The company wasn't just behind the technological curve, it was operating on borrowed time. 3 of our main production lines were running on equipment that was fully depreciated and increasingly unreliable. Quality control issues had led to a spike in returns and warranty claims. Key clients were reducing their orders, while our production costs continued to rise relative to competitors. Monday morning, I called my first executive team meeting. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense. Half the executives had been my father's loyal lieutenants for decades. The other half were younger, more recently hired, and generally supportive of modernization, but wary of the sudden leadership change. "I've reviewed the company's financial position," I began without preamble. "The situation is more critical than most of you have been led to believe." I displayed the actual financial data on the screen, stripped of the creative accounting that had masked our true position. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This isn't about assigning blame," I continued. It's about confronting reality. Mitchell Manufacturing has roughly 4 months of operating capital at current burn rates. Our credit lines are maxed out. 3 major clients are considering taking their business elsewhere. Frank Russo, our long-serving CFO and one of my father's closest allies, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Olivia, your father managed through downturns before. This is cyclical. This isn't cyclical, Frank, I interrupted, pulling up a 10-year trend analysis. This is structural. Our production methods are outdated. Our energy costs are 40% above industry average. Our labor productivity lags competitors by nearly 30%. I switched to another slide showing customer retention metrics. We've lost 17% of our client base in the past 3 years, not to overseas competitors, but to domestic manufacturers who've modernized their operations. The room had gone very quiet. Even Frank was staring at the numbers with new concern. But there's good news, I continued, changing the display again. We're not starting from zero. The Advanced Technologies Division, which will now be integrated throughout our operations, has already developed solutions to many of these challenges. I outlined the modernization plan in detail, not the glossy version I'd prepared for the board, but the nuts and bolts implementation strategy, complete with timelines, resource allocations, and measurable objectives. This transformation will be comprehensive, I explained. We're not just updating machinery, we're reimagining our entire production philosophy, supply chain, and customer engagement approach. Martin Chen, our head of operations and one of the younger executives, raised his hand. This is ambitious, Olivia. How do we keep the lights on while making these changes? It was the right question, one that acknowledged both the necessity of change and the practical challenges of implementation. We phase it in, I replied. Production Line C will be converted first, allowing us to test and refine the new systems before rolling them out more broadly. Meanwhile, Lines A and B continue, operating to maintain cash flow. I walked them through the phased implementation plan, detailing how we would retrain workers, reconfigure the factory floor, and gradually transition clients to the new production methods. The strategy balanced immediate survival needs with long-term transformation goals. By the end of the 3-hour meeting, even the skeptics were cautiously engaged with the plan. Not fully convinced, perhaps, but willing to consider that this new direction might be the company's best hope for survival. Frank lingered after the others had left. He'd been with Mitchell Manufacturing since before I was born, hired by my grandfather and promoted by my father. His loyalty to the Mitchell name ran deep. Your father built this company, he said quietly. My grandfather built it, I corrected. Dad inherited it and maintained it for his generation. Now it's time for the next evolution. Frank nodded slowly. He won't forgive this easily, taking his company. I didn't take it, Frank. He was losing it. I met his gaze directly. You knew the numbers. You helped hide them from the board. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I was protecting the company's reputation. You were enabling its decline, I countered, but without rancor. Now you have a choice. Help me save it or clean out your desk. Either way, Mitchell Manufacturing is changing course. Frank was silent for a long moment, weighing decades of loyalty against the undeniable reality of our situation. Finally, he straightened his shoulders. What do you need from finance first? A complete, honest accounting. No creative bookkeeping. No hidden problems. I need to know exactly where we stand if we're going to move forward. You'll have it by tomorrow afternoon, he promised. That conversation set the pattern for my first month as CEO. One by one, I met with department heads, team leaders, and key personnel. Some embraced the new direction immediately. Others needed convincing. A few resigned rather than adapt. But gradually, momentum began to build. The factory floor presented different challenges. Many of our production workers had been with the company for 20 years or more. They'd developed skills specific to our traditional manufacturing methods and viewed automation with suspicion, as a threat to their livelihoods rather than an enhancement of their capabilities. I decided to address these concerns directly. Rather than sending memos or delegating to HR, I held small group meetings with production teams, explaining the changes and answering questions face to face. "I understand your concerns," I told the Line B team during one such meeting. "Change is difficult, especially when you've mastered your current role." Dave Mercer, a machinist with 25 years at Mitchell, spoke up. "With respect, Ms. Mitchell, we've heard modernization talk before. Usually means fewer jobs and more pressure on those who stay." Several others nodded in agreement. The how. Fear was palpable and legitimate, based on how many American manufacturing workers had seen their jobs eliminated in recent decades. "That's a fair concern," I acknowledged. "But our approach is different. We're not replacing skilled workers with machines. We're enhancing your capabilities with better tools." I brought up schematics of the new production system on a tablet and passed it around. "This setup still requires your expertise. The difference is that the new equipment handles the repetitive, physically demanding aspects while you manage the complex decisions and quality oversight." As they examined the designs, I continued. "More importantly, everyone who wants to stay at Mitchell, manufacturing will have a place. We've budgeted for comprehensive retraining. Some roles will change, but no one loses their job because of modernization." Skepticism remained, but I saw the first glimmers of cautious interest. These were skilled people who took pride in their work. They weren't opposed to improvement. They just needed assurance that improvement included them. "I grew up watching many of you work," I reminded them. "My first summer job was in shipping with Mr. Henderson. I learned quality control from Ms. Patel. You taught me this business from the ground up. I'm not looking to discard that knowledge. I want to build on it." The mention of my early days on the factory floor, something my father had insisted upon despite my protests at the time, helped bridge the gap. Unlike Nathan, who had never worked with his hands, I had history with these teams. I'd earned calluses alongside them before earning my engineering degree. By the end of that first month, we'd begun the process of transforming Production Line C. The changes were immediate and visible. Old equipment removed, new systems installed, the physical space reconfigured for improved workflow. We selected a pilot team of volunteers from various departments, people willing to learn the new methods and help refine them before broader implementation. Not everything went smoothly. The first test runs revealed integration problems between systems. Software glitches caused production delays. Suppliers missed deadlines for critical components. Each setback fueled the skeptics who believed modernization was a mistake. But there were victories, too. Energy consumption on Line C dropped by 34% within 3 weeks. Quality metrics improved dramatically. Production speed increased while requiring less physical strain from workers. Most significantly, 3 former clients who had reduced their orders over the past year agreed to visit the modernized line. All 3 committed to new contracts after seeing the improvements firsthand. Throughout these early weeks, I deliberately maintained a low public profile. There were no press releases about the leadership change, no interviews about our new direction. I wanted results to speak before I did. Nathan surprised me by becoming one of the modernization effort's strongest advocates. Free from our father's shadow, he revealed business development skills I hadn't fully appreciated. His ability to translate our technical improvements into benefits that resonated with clients proved invaluable. "You know," he said one evening as we reviewed progress reports in my office, "Dad never let me see the real numbers. I had no idea how bad things had gotten." "He was protecting you," I suggested, "in his own way." Nate shook his head. He was protecting himself, his image, his legacy. He sighed, looking around the office that still bore our father's decorating preferences. "I bought into it completely. The great Richard Mitchell, building an empire. He did build something significant, I acknowledged. The company employed hundreds of people, supported their families. That matters. But he couldn't adapt. Nate's expression was thoughtful. He couldn't see that preservation sometimes requires change. That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with my brother. We'd never been close, shaped by our father's tendency to view his children as competitors rather than allies. Now, working toward a common goal, we were discovering complementary strengths. 6 weeks into the transformation, we faced our first major crisis. A critical supplier declared bankruptcy, leaving us without essential components for both our traditional production lines and the modernized system. Production threatened to halt entirely within days. I called an emergency meeting of the executive. Options? I asked, looking around the table. Ideas came rapidly, some practical, others less so. We could seek alternative suppliers, though quality might vary. We could temporarily revert to older components on the modernized line, sacrificing efficiency. We could prioritize certain client orders and delay others. Then Martin Chen, our operations head, made a suggestion that would never have been considered, under my father's leadership. What if we make the components ourselves? Heads turned toward him. Explain, I prompted. The 3D printing capability we installed for prototyping on Line C, he continued. With some modifications, we could produce limited runs of the components we need most urgently. Not a permanent solution, but enough to keep us running until we secure a new supplier. Under the old Mitchell manufacturing, the idea would have been dismissed immediately. We were parts assemblers, not parts creators. Such categories were inviolable in my father's world. How quickly could we implement this? I asked. Martin looked surprised, then pleased that his unconventional suggestion was being taken seriously. 48 hours for setup and testing. We'd be producing usable components by the 3rd day. Quality concerns? We'll need enhanced inspection protocols, but preliminary tests suggest we can meet specifications. I turned to Frank. Costs. He frowned over his tablet. Higher per unit than our supplier charged, but lower than emergency sourcing from overseas. And no shipping delays. Do it, I decided. And let's evaluate whether this capability should become permanent. It could reduce our vulnerability to supply chain disruptions. That crisis, managed successfully through innovation rather than tradition, became a turning point for company culture. It demonstrated in concrete terms that our new approach wasn't just about fancy equipment. It was about agility, problem-solving, and breaking down artificial constraints. 2 months in, we completed the conversion of Line C and began preparations for Line B. The improved performance metrics could no longer be dismissed as flukes or short-term gains. Energy efficiency was up, defect rates were down, worker injuries had decreased by 60%. Most importantly, production costs had declined while output increased. The financial picture, though still challenging, had begun to improve. New orders were coming in, attracted by our enhanced capabilities and competitive pricing. The bank, seeing measurable progress against our recovery plan, relaxed some loan conditions. It was time to go public with our transformation. We invited industry press to tour the modernized facility, highlighting not just the technological improvements but also our commitment to worker retraining and job preservation. The resulting coverage positioned Mitchell Manufacturing as a model for how traditional American manufacturers could modernize without outsourcing or mass layoffs. The most satisfying moment came when a prominent industry publication ran a feature titled The Mitchell Renaissance, describing our company as bridging manufacturing's past and future under bold new leadership. I kept a copy of that article, not out of vanity, but as a milestone marker. It represented not just my personal validation, but the company's successful pivot toward sustainability. Throughout this period, I had no contact with my father. He had moved to the lake house he'd owned for years, a retreat he'd rarely used during his working years, but now apparently served as his full-time residence. My mother divided her time between there and her sister's home in Pennsylvania, maintaining her distance from both the company and me. My focus remained firmly on the transformation at hand rather than family reconciliation. There would be time for that later, perhaps, if my father could eventually accept the new reality. For now, Mitchell Manufacturing required my complete attention. The third month brought another test, one I hadn't anticipated. A major competitor, sensing our vulnerability during transition, launched an aggressive campaign to poach our clients. They offered steep temporary discounts, extended payment terms, and expedited delivery schedules, all designed to lure customers away while we were still implementing our changes. Several clients called to inform us they were considering these offers. 2 actually switched, unable to risk potential disruptions during our modernization. The immediate financial impact was manageable, but the threat to our recovery plan was serious. If the exodus continued, even our improved operations wouldn't generate sufficient revenue. I consulted with Nathan, whose client relationships had proven invaluable during the transition. "We need to counter this directly," he advised. "Not with matching discounts, we can't afford that, but with something they can't offer." "Such as?" "Partnership," he suggested. "These customers aren't just looking for parts. They're looking for solutions to their manufacturing challenges. We're becoming more innovative. Let's leverage that." It was an insightful observation. Under our father's leadership, Mitchell Manufacturing had viewed itself solely as a components supplier. Clients placed orders, we filled them. The relationship ended there. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "Innovation workshops," Nathan explained, warming to his concept. "We invite key clients to bring their engineering teams here. We show them not just our new production capabilities, but how those capabilities can help solve their design challenges." The idea aligned perfectly with my long-term vision for the company. I'd always believed we should be more than just a vendor. We should be a partner in our clients' success. We launched the first innovation workshop 2 weeks later. 3 major clients participated, bringing senior engineers and product designers. We demonstrated our new capabilities, then broke into collaborative sessions focused on their specific challenges. The results exceeded our expectations. Not only did all 3 clients commit to maintaining their business with us, but 2 expanded their orders based on design improvements developed during the workshop. Word spread, and requests to participate in future workshops began coming in, even from companies that weren't current customers. This initiative evolved into a key differentiator for Mitchell Manufacturing. While competitors focused on price and traditional metrics, we were building collaborative relationships that created mutual value. It wasn't just about selling parts anymore. It was about contributing to product innovation. By the end of the ISI 4th month, our transformation had gained undeniable momentum. Line B was fully converted, showing the same impressive improvements as Line C. Line A's conversion was underway. Financial projections, once dire, now showed a path to profitability within 6 months. Most heartening was the change in company culture. The initial resistance had largely given way to cautious enthusiasm, then active engagement. Employees began suggesting improvements to the new systems. Cross-functional teams formed spontaneously to address challenges. The rigid departmental boundaries that had characterized my father's era were dissolving in favor of more collaborative approaches. During this period of intense focus on the company, my personal life had been largely set aside. I worked 14-hour days, often sleeping on the couch in my office rather than returning to my small apartment. Meals were hastily consumed during meetings. Exercise consisted of walking the factory floor. Friends called less frequently, having grown accustomed to my brief distracted responses. One rainy Tuesday evening, as I reviewed production reports alone in my office, Harold Bennett appeared in my doorway. My father's oldest friend, and now my most supportive board member, Harold, had watched the Mitchell family drama unfold over decades. "You need a break, Olivia," he said without preamble. I glanced up from my screen. "Just finishing the quarterly projections." "It's 8:30, he pointed out. "And I'd bet good money you haven't left this building since yesterday morning." I couldn't argue with that assessment. We're at a critical phase with Line A. If we can maintain the current pace, the company won't collapse if you take one evening off, Harold interrupted gently. In fact, it might benefit from a CEO who occasionally remembers she's human. There was wisdom in his observation, though I was reluctant to admit it. The drive to prove myself, to justify the board's faith, to validate my vision, to show I wasn't the failure my father had declared me to be, had pushed me to an unsustainable pace. 1 hour, Harold suggested. Have dinner at an actual restaurant, walk in the park, call a friend. Then you can return to saving the industrial world. His kind humor broke through my resistance. Fine, I conceded, shutting down my computer. 1 hour. That hour turned into 2 as I discovered how hungry I was for something other than vending machine snacks and takeout eaten cold at my desk. I found a small bistro still serving dinner, ordered actual food, and called my friend Megan, who had been leaving increasingly concerned messages. "She lives!" Megan exclaimed when she heard my voice. "I was about to file a missing persons report." "Just busy," I explained, realizing how inadequate that sounded. "The company transformation has consumed every waking minute." "And the family situation?" she asked carefully. Megan had witnessed many of the tensions between my father and me over the years, offering support without judgment. "Non-existent at the moment," I admitted. "Dad's at the lake house. Mom's divided between there and Aunt Patricia's. Nate and I are focused on the business." "Have you thought about reaching out?" Megan suggested. "Not to apologize. You have nothing to apologize for, but just to check in?" I hadn't, actually. The clean break had been simpler, allowing me to channel all my energy into the company rather than navigating complex family dynamics. But as the business stabilized, the absence of family connections, even the difficult ones, left a noticeable void. "Maybe soon," I said, more to end the conversation than from genuine intent. After dinner, I walked through the small park near the restaurant, allowing myself to notice the evening air, the distant laughter of children on the playground, the rhythmic splashing of the fountain. For the first time in months, I wasn't running mental calculations or rehearsing presentations or troubleshooting production challenges. I was simply present, breathing, existing as more than Mitchell Manufacturing's CEO. The brief respite provided perspective I hadn't realized I needed. The company transformation was succeeding not because I was working myself to exhaustion, but because the fundamental strategy was sound and the team was aligned behind it. My value wasn't in doing everything personally, but in setting direction and empowering others to execute. When I returned to the office that evening, I made 2 decisions. First, I would establish more sustainable work patterns, not just for my own well-being, but to model healthy leadership for the organization. Second, I would begin thinking about the personal side of the Mitchell family drama. The business revolution was well underway. Perhaps a more personal reconciliation deserved attention as well. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, Nathan stopped by my office, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I talked to Mom yesterday," he began. "How is she?" I asked, genuinely curious. My mother and I had never been particularly close. She had always deferred to my father's judgment, including his assessment of me, but I didn't wish her ill. "Struggling," Nate admitted. "Dad's not adjusting well to retirement. She's caught between his bitterness and her own uncertainty." I nodded, unsurprised. My father had defined himself by his role as company patriarch for so long that its loss would naturally create an identity crisis. "She asked about you," Nate continued. Not directly. She's still afraid of angering Dad. But she wanted to know how you're doing with all of this. What did you tell her? The truth. That you're working too hard but doing remarkable things with the company. That the changes you've implemented are saving jobs and creating new opportunities. He paused. I told her you've never disparaged Dad, even to me. That was accurate. Despite everything, I'd maintained a strict policy of focusing on business issues rather than personal grievances. The company transformation wasn't about proving my father wrong. It was about making Mitchell Manufacturing right for its next chapter. Dad's birthday is next Saturday, Nate said cautiously. Mom's planning a small dinner at the lake house. Nothing formal. She didn't want to ask you directly, but I think she'd like you to come. My immediate instinct was to decline. The wound of that public dismissal at the company picnic remained tender, and the prospect of facing my father in his home territory seemed unnecessarily stressful when I was already carrying the weight of company transformation. But Harold's gentle reminder that I was human first, CEO second, echoed in my mind. The Mitchell family dynamics were complex and often painful, but they were still my dynamics. Running the company my father had built while maintaining complete personal estrangement was creating a compartmentalization that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. I'll think about it, I told Nathan, not yet ready to commit, but not immediately refusing either. That evening, I left work at a reasonable hour and drove to the small apartment I rarely spent time in. As I prepared a simple dinner, I considered the invitation. What would attending my father's birthday dinner actually accomplish? Was reconciliation even possible, given the history between us? Was it necessary for my own well-being? These questions had no simple answers. The relationship with my father had shaped so much of my identity, often through resistance to his judgments rather than acceptance of them. His dismissal had wounded me deeply, but had also catalyzed the decisive action that now defined my professional life. I wasn't seeking his approval anymore. That need had burned away in the flames of public humiliation and subsequent transformation. But perhaps there was value in demonstrating that I could move beyond resentment, that I could engage with him as an equal, rather than as a perpetually disapproved of daughter. After dinner, I called my mother directly, something I hadn't done since the day of the company picnic. Olivia, she answered, her surprise evident in the single word. I didn't expect. Nathan mentioned Dad's birthday dinner, I said, bypassing awkward preliminaries. Is my presence actually wanted, or was this Nate's idea? My mother hesitated, and I could almost see her calculating the potential reactions, weighing risks, and benefits as she had throughout my childhood when mediating between my father and me. It was my idea, she finally admitted. Your father doesn't know I suggested it. Interesting. My mother rarely took independent action on family matters. Why now? I asked. Another pause. Because this separation isn't healthy. For any of us. Her voice grew quieter. And because I should have stepped in long ago, before things reached this point. It was the closest my mother had ever come to acknowledging her role in enabling my father's treatment of me. Not quite an apology, but a recognition that something had been wrong with the family dynamic. I can't promise how your father will react, she continued, but Nathan will be there, and I would like to see you, Olivia. The simplicity of that statement, free from the usual qualifications and conditions, decided me. What time? I asked. And should I bring anything? Relief colored her response. 7 o'clock, and just yourself. That will be enough. As I ended the call, I wondered if I was making a mistake. The Mitchell Manufacturing transformation was proceeding well, my professional identity solidifying in my new role. Did I really need to revisit the family dynamics that had caused so much pain? Perhaps not. But growth meant engaging with complexity rather than avoiding it. The next chapter of my life, and the company's life, shouldn't be defined solely by reaction against the past. It needed to incorporate the lessons learned while creating something authentically new. Besides, I thought with a small smile as I prepared for bed, I was curious to see if Richard Mitchell had learned anything from his own professional transformation, from company patriarch to retired observer. Had his rigid worldview bent at all under the pressure of changed circumstances? Had he developed any capacity for self-reflection? Saturday would provide those answers, for better or worse. In the meantime, Mitchell Manufacturing continued its metamorphosis from struggling traditional manufacturer to innovative industry leader. The personal reckoning could wait a few more days while the professional one continued to unfold. The drive to my parents' lake house took nearly 2 hours, following winding roads that transitioned from suburban developments to increasingly rural landscapes. I hadn't visited in over 3 years, not since a tense Thanksgiving that had ended, with my early departure after my father dismissed my concerns about the company's direction as hysteria over normal market fluctuations. The property itself was beautiful, 5 acres on a secluded cove with a custom-built cedar home my father had commissioned when the company had its most profitable year. Unlike the formal Tudor in Forest Hills where I'd grown up, the lake house had a rustic, relaxed quality. It was the one place I'd occasionally seen my father without a tie, his shoulders losing their perpetual rigidity as he cast fishing lines from the private dock. I parked beside Nathan's SUV, noting my mother's sedan and my father's Range Rover already in the circular drive. Taking a deep breath, I retrieved the small wrapped package from my passenger seat. Not a birthday gift exactly, but something I'd decided might serve as a conversation bridge, and approached the front door. My mother answered before I could knock, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Olivia," she said, stepping back to let me enter. "You came." "I said I would," I replied, accepting her brief, awkward hug. The house smelled of roasting meat and pine, familiar scents that triggered memories of rare family weekends when business pressures temporarily receded and something almost like normal family dynamics emerged. Those had been precious days, the closest my father ever came to relaxation, the few times I remembered him laughing without reservation. "Nathan's on the deck," my mother offered. "Your father is getting ready. Dinner in about 30 minutes. The careful way she delivered this information told me all I needed to know. My father was aware of my impending arrival and preparing himself, mentally, if not physically. Whether that preparation involved rehearsing cutting remarks or practicing civil conversation remained to be seen. I found Nathan leaning against the deck railing, beer in hand, gazing out at the lake where early evening sun transformed the surface into hammered gold. He turned at the sound of the door sliding open, relief washing over his features. "You made it," he said, offering a cold bottle from the cooler beside him. "I wasn't entirely sure you would." "Neither was I admitted, accepting the drink. "How's the atmosphere?" Nathan shrugged. "Tense. Dad hasn't said much all day. Mom's been cooking since dawn, like she can somehow create family harmony through perfect pot roast." I smiled despite myself. Our mother's response to family conflict had always been intensified domesticity, as though properly set tables and elaborate meals could compensate for emotional dysfunction. "Has he said anything about me coming?" "Just, Nathan tells me Olivia might join us." My brother imitated our father's clipped tone perfectly. Neither approval nor disapproval, just acknowledgement. For Richard Mitchell, that qualified as restraint. I'd expected more direct antagonism, perhaps even a preemptive strike about my hostile takeover of his company. "How are things at the plant?" Nathan asked, clearly seeking safer conversational territory. I let him guide us toward business discussion, filling him in on developments since his last visit to the factory. Line A's conversion was proceeding ahead of schedule. The innovation workshops had generated 2 potential new clients. Worker productivity continued to improve as they grew more comfortable with the modernized systems. We were deep in conversation, about a new market opportunity when the deck door slid open again. My father stood framed in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the interior light. He'd aged in the months since I'd last seen him, more gray at his temples, deeper lines around his mouth, but his posture remained commanding, shoulders squared as if perpetually braced for resistance. Nathan. Olivia. His greeting was neutral, neither warm nor overtly hostile. Dad, we responded in near unison. An awkward silence stretched between us. Nathan glanced from our father to me, clearly hoping one of us would break the impasse with something more substantial than monosyllables. Happy birthday, I finally offered, raising my bottle slightly in a minimal toast. My father nodded in acknowledgement. Your mother said to tell you dinner is ready. With that, he turned and went back inside, leaving the door open behind him. Nathan and I exchanged glances, his apologetic, mine resigned. This would not be an evening of dramatic reconciliation then. At best, it might be a careful navigation of old wounds without reopening them. Dinner began in strained silence. My mother had indeed prepared pot roast, my father's favorite, along with roasted potatoes, glazed carrots, and homemade rolls. The table was set with the special occasion china that rarely left its cabinet, crystal glasses catching the light from overhead fixtures. My father sat at the head of the table, as he always had. My mother took her place at the opposite end, with Nathan and me facing each other across the middle expanse. The physical arrangement highlighted the emotional distance, each of us isolated in our respective positions, separated by far more than polished mahogany. This looks wonderful, Mom, Nathan said, dutifully breaking the silence after we'd helped ourselves to food. Thank you, dear. She smiled, some of her tension easing. I found a new recipe for the carrots, maple glaze instead of brown sugar. The mundane exchange seemed to release something in the atmosphere. Not warmth exactly, but a slight relaxation of the invisible restraints that had kept us all rigidly formal. The company announced quarterly results last week, my father said, suddenly his focus on his plate rather than any of us, up 17%, year over year. It wasn't the opening I had expected. Not praise, certainly, but an acknowledgement of Mitchell Manufacturing's improving performance under my leadership. The modernization initiatives are bearing fruit, faster than projected, I replied carefully, matching his neutral tone. Energy efficiency improvements alone have reduced production costs significantly. He nodded, still not looking directly at me. The Westridge contract, you got it back. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes. The innovation workshop convinced them our new capabilities aligned with their product development needs. Innovation workshop. He repeated the words slowly, as if examining an unfamiliar concept. That was Nathan's idea? Liv and I developed it together, Nathan interjected, casting me a quick glance. But it evolved from her vision of the company as a partner in client success, not just a supplier. My father absorbed this information in silence, cutting his meat with precise movements. The conversation lapsed again, the only sounds the gentle click of silverware against china and the background hum of the refrigerator from the adjacent kitchen. I brought something, I said, after several minutes had passed. Not exactly a birthday present, but I thought you might find it interesting. I retrieved the wrapped package from where I'd set it on a side table and placed it beside my father's plate. He looked at it with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, curiosity tempered with wariness. Open it, Richard, my mother encouraged when he made no move to take it. With deliberate motions, he removed the simple wrapping paper to reveal a leather-bound book. Not a commercially published volume, but a custom piece I'd had created specifically for this occasion. Opening it, he found photographs, technical specifications, and narrative descriptions documenting Mitchell Manufacturing's evolution over the past 5 months. The Mitchell Legacy, he read from the title page, his voice carefully controlled. It's a record of the transformation, I explained. Not just the technical changes, but the human stories behind them. How Dave Mercer from Line B helped redesign the workflow to reduce physical strain while improving precision. How Elena Rodriguez developed a digital quality control system that's reduced defects by 80%. My father turned pages slowly, examining images of modernized production lines alongside portraits of the employees who operated them. Many faces would be familiar to him, people who had worked at Mitchell Manufacturing for decades, whose hands and expertise had built the company's reputation for reliability. I wanted you to see that we're not erasing what came before, I continued, finding myself unexpectedly nervous as I watched his expression. We're building on it. The core values you instilled, craftsmanship, reliability, pride in work, those remain central. We've just updated the methods to preserve them in a changing marketplace. He paused on a page showing side-by-side photographs of the main production floor, before modernization and after. The transformation was striking but not absolute. Certain elements remained deliberately unchanged, including the hand-finishing station where our most skilled craftspeople applied final touches to precision components. You kept the Sanders workbenches, he noted, referring to the custom stations my grandfather had commissioned from a local woodworker when the company first expanded beyond its original facility. They're part of our heritage, I replied simply. And they're still the best design for the detail work on the Legacy line components. The Legacy line had been my idea, a premium product category that maintained traditional manufacturing methods for specialty items where the human touch remained superior to automation. It was a small portion of our overall production, but commanded premium prices and preserved specific skills that would otherwise be lost. Who runs the Legacy line? My father asked, still studying the photographs. Jim Collins. He apprenticed under Stanley Weber back when you first joined the company. A ghost of a smile touched my father's lips. Old Stan, toughest craftsman I ever met, rejected an entire production run once because the tolerance was off by 0.02 of an inch. Jim maintains that standard, I assured him. He's training 3 apprentices now. We've established a formal program to preserve those specialized skills. My father closed the book carefully, running his hand over the embossed cover. The gesture was almost tender, the same way I'd seen him touch vintage machinery or examine particularly fine components. You didn't have to do this, he said finally, looking directly at me for the first time that evening. Do what? Preserve any of it. You had financing, board approval, momentum. You could have gutted everything and started fresh. Many would. The observation surprised me. Not just the content, but the absence of accusation in his tone. He was stating a fact, not leveling a criticism. That would have been wasteful, I replied honestly. The company doesn't need wholesale replacement. It needed selective modernization, strategic redirection. And my removal, he added, but without the bitterness I'd expected. I met his gaze, steadily. The company needed leadership committed to necessary changes. You made it clear that wouldn't be you. The table fell silent again. My mother looked anxiously between us, while Nathan watched with careful attention, ready to intervene if the conversation veered toward confrontation. But my father surprised me again. Perhaps not, he conceded, the words clearly difficult for him. Change has never been my strong suit. It was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging a personal limitation. The Richard Mitchell I'd grown up with presented himself as infallible, his judgments beyond question. This small admission represented a significant shift. The pot roast is getting cold, my mother interjected, her tone artificially bright. Shall I serve more vegetables? The mundane question broke the intensity of the moment. We resumed eating, the conversation shifting to safer topics. Nathan's recent fishing trip, my mother's garden club activities, a new restaurant that had opened in town. Not warm family banter, but civil exchange free from the undercurrents that had characterized so many previous gatherings. After dinner, my father excused himself briefly, returning with a folder that he placed on the cleared table. "Monthly management reports," he explained. "Harold has been sending them. I've been following the transition." This, too, was unexpected. I'd assumed he'd cut all ties with the company, nurturing his resentment in isolation. "You've shifted production focus toward precision components for medical and aerospace applications," he observed, "moving away from automotive." I nodded. Those sectors value quality and innovation over rock-bottom pricing. They align better with our capabilities. "Smart," he acknowledged. "I considered a similar shift in the 90s, but couldn't justify the retooling costs then." The conversation that followed was the most substantive we'd ever had about business strategy. Without the power dynamics that had characterized our previous interactions, him as authoritative CEO, me as the perpetually questioning subordinate, we engaged almost as peers. He asked incisive questions about market positioning, capital allocation, workforce development. I answered directly, neither defensive nor deferential. Nathan contributed occasionally, particularly regarding client relationships and competitive positioning. Even my mother offered relevant observations about community perception and employee morale, drawn from her ongoing social connections with families tied to the company. As the evening progressed, I realized we were having the kind of family business discussion I'd always wanted, but never experienced. One where each person's perspective was considered on its merits rather than its source, where ideas could be explored without immediate judgment. "You should visit," I said during a natural pause in the conversation. "See the changes firsthand." My father's expression shuddered slightly. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate. It's your company now." "It's still Mitchell Manufacturing," I countered. "Your experience and institutional knowledge have value, even if we're moving in new directions." He seemed genuinely startled by the suggestion. "You'd want my input?" After he had publicly humiliated and fired me, after he had declared me worthless, after I had been forced to orchestrate a takeover to save the company he was running into the ground. "Not as CEO," I clarified. "That role is filled. But as someone who understands this industry and this company's history, yes, there could be value in your perspective." My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Briefly, a gesture of gratitude I hadn't expected. Nathan's expression mingled surprise with approval. My father was silent for a long moment, looking down at the management report spread before him. When he finally spoke, his voice held none of the defensive pride I'd anticipated. "I'd like that," he said simply. We didn't discuss specific arrangements, when he might visit, what that visit would entail. The tentative bridge between us was too newly constructed to bear much weight. But something fundamental had shifted during those hours around the dining table. Not forgiveness exactly, nor complete reconciliation, but the first steps towards a different kind of relationship. As I prepared to leave later that evening, my father walked me to the door while my mother and Nathan remained in the kitchen, giving us a moment of privacy that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "The book," he said, gesturing to where it sat on the entry hall table. "Thank you for that, for showing me the connection between what was and what is becoming." "The Mitchell legacy doesn't begin or end with either of us," I replied. "We're just custodians for a time." He nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. Not the approval I'd once desperately sought, but something more valuable. Recognition of me as a separate individual with my own valid path, not merely an extension or rejection of his. "Drive safely," he said as I stepped onto the porch. "The lake roads can be tricky after dark." It wasn't an emotional farewell, but it wasn't meant to be. We were finding our way toward a new kind of connection, one built on mutual recognition rather than dominance and defiance. The process would take time, with likely setbacks along the way. but the foundation had been laid. As I drove back toward the city, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The company transformation was proceeding. Well, but this personal evolution might prove equally significant for my long-term well-being. I had defined myself for so long in opposition to my father that finding a different basis for identity, one that neither rejected nor required his validation, represented its own kind of freedom. The weeks following the birthday dinner brought accelerated progress on multiple fronts. Line A's modernization completed ahead of schedule and under budget, allowing full implementation of our integrated production system. The legacy line expanded, its client base, attracting specialty manufacturers willing to pay premium prices for components that combined traditional craftsmanship with modern precision. Financial results continued to improve, with the company recording its first quarterly profit in over 2 years. Employee morale rose as success breeds success, the initial skepticism about modernization now largely replaced by pride in being part of an innovative resurgence. Nathan and I settled into complementary leadership roles. I focused on operations, technology, and overall strategy, while he excelled at client relationships, marketing, and external communications. The sibling rivalry our father had subtly encouraged throughout our lives gave way to genuine collaboration, each of us recognizing and respecting the other's strengths. My father's promised visit to the factory took place 3 weeks after his birthday. I arranged it carefully, scheduling time for him to tour each production area and speak with key personnel, while ensuring he understood his role as observer rather than authority figure. The day could easily have become awkward or tense, the former CEO returning to the company that had moved on without him. But his behavior surprised me once again. He arrived precisely on time, dressed not in his usual formal business attire, but in casual slacks and a button-down shirt without tie. The subtle sartorial choice signaled his acceptance of his changed relationship to the company, no longer its commanding officer but an interested visitor. "Welcome to Mitchell Manufacturing," I greeted him in the lobby, deliberately using the formal welcome we extended to all visitors. He nodded, taking in the redesigned reception area with its displays highlighting both company history and recent innovations. "The place looks different. We've updated the public spaces to reflect our new direction," I explained, leading him toward the first stop on our scheduled tour. More open, more transparent, like the company itself. The modernized production floor drew his closest attention. He moved slowly between workstations, observing the integrated systems, occasionally asking operators specific questions about their experience with the new equipment. Not challenging or critical questions, but genuine inquiries about functionality, efficiency, ergonomics. When we reached the legacy line, he spent nearly twice the allocated time watching the skilled craftspeople apply finishing touches to specialty components. Jim Collins, the line supervisor, greeted him with the respect due a founder, but without the deference of a subordinate. "Mr. Mitchell, good to see you again." "Jim." My father shook his hand warmly. "The work looks excellent, as always." "Different tools, same standards," Jim replied with quiet pride. "Your granddaughter made sure we kept what worked while fixing what didn't." The reference to my grandfather, the original Mitchell who had established the company's reputation for quality, wasn't lost on either of us. Jim had subtly placed us both in the context of a larger legacy, neither diminishing my father's contributions nor ignoring the necessary changes I'd implemented. "She made the right call," my father acknowledged, surprising me with the direct approval. "These skills are irreplaceable." The tour continued through engineering, quality control, shipping, and finally to the executive offices. Throughout, my father maintained the demeanor of an interested observer, offering occasional insights from his long experience, but never attempting to assert authority or criticize current methods. In the conference room, over lunch with the executive team, He even shared valuable historical context about certain clients. Information that helped explain long-established preferences and potentially opened new opportunities for expanded relationships. Precision Tool Works started as a military contractor, he noted when their name came up in discussion. Even though they're primarily commercial now, that heritage influences their expectations about documentation, traceability, and redundancy. Provisions. Martin Chen, our operations director, looked thoughtful. That explains why they responded so positively to our enhanced quality verification system. They see it as risk mitigation, not just defect prevention. My father nodded. Exactly. For them, reliability isn't just about the component working. It's about being able to prove every step of the production process met specifications. The CAI exchange exemplified what I'd hoped for from his visit. Specific insights that added value without undermining current leadership. By the time the day concluded, several executives who had initially viewed the former CEO's visit with apprehension were actively engaging him in conversation, drawing on his institutional knowledge while respecting the company's new direction. As we walked toward the exit at day's end, my father paused to look back at the production floor visible through large interior windows. Another change from his era, when management spaces had been carefully separated from manufacturing areas. "You've done well," he said quietly. "Better than I could have." The simple acknowledgement hit me with unexpected force. After decades of striving for recognition that never seemed to come, hearing those words felt momentous, not because I still needed his approval, but because it represented his growth as much as mine. "The company needed something different than when you led it," I replied. "Different times? Different challenges?" He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I couldn't see. It didn't want to see it, probably. The signs were there. We continued toward the lobby in companionable silence, the acknowledgement hanging between us, not quite an apology, but a recognition of the truth that had precipitated our professional separation. At the main entrance, I extended my hand, formally maintaining the professional boundaries that defined our new relationship. My father took it, his grip firm but not dominating. "Thank you for today," I said. "Your insights were valuable." "Thank you for the invitation," he replied. "It means a great deal to see the company thriving again." As he turned to leave, he added, "Your mother mentioned Sunday dinner this weekend. A standing invitation, apparently." The casual reference to ongoing family connection caught me off guard. We had successfully navigated one birthday dinner and a professional visit, but regular family gatherings represented a different level of reconciliation. One I hadn't been certain was possible. "I'll check my calendar," I said, not committing but not refusing either. He nodded, accepting the tentative response. "Whatever works with your schedule." She just thought, it might be good. For all of us. With that, he walked to his car, his posture straight but lacking the rigid formality I associated with Richard Mitchell, CEO. He moved like a man finding his way into a new identity, still proud, still dignified, but somehow more human than the corporate patriarch who had dominated my youth. I watched him drive away, reflecting on the unexpected evolution of our relationship. The company takeover had been necessary and right. Mitchell Manufacturing was thriving under new leadership and modernized operations. But the complete severance of family ties had not been an inevitable consequence, despite the pain and public humiliation that had precipitated the change. We were finding a different path forward, not erasing the past, but building something new that acknowledged both the wounds and the connections that defined us as a family. Like the company itself, we were selectively preserving what had value while changing what needed to change. Back in my office, I found Nathan waiting, curious about how the visit had gone. "No disasters?" he asked, only half joking. "Surprisingly, productive," I replied, settling behind my desk. He actually provided some useful historical context on several client relationships. And personally, how was that side of things? I considered the question carefully. Evolving. He mentioned Mom's standing dinner invitation. Nathan smiled. She's determined to restore some version of family connection. Been talking about it for weeks now. Is that what you want? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Regular. Family gatherings, pretending the blow-up never happened? Not pretending, he corrected. Acknowledging it happened, but not letting it define everything going forward. Dad messed up, monumentally. The company nearly failed because of his stubbornness. He humiliated you publicly and unfairly. I nodded, appreciating his clear-eyed assessment. But, Nathan continued, he's also learning from it. I've seen changes in him these past months that I honestly didn't think were possible. He's quieter, more reflective. He actually listens sometimes. The observation aligned with my own experience during the factory tour. My father asking questions rather than delivering pronouncements, absorbing information rather than immediately judging it. So you think regular family contact is worth pursuing? I pressed. Nathan shrugged. I think completely cutting ties would be another kind of loss. Not just for him or Mom, but for us too. There's damage, yeah. Real damage. But maybe also potential for something different going forward. His perspective echoed my own emerging thoughts. That total estrangement might be emotionally satisfying in the short term, but ultimately limiting for my own growth. The company takeover had been necessary for business reasons, but allowing it to permanently sever family connections would grant my father's worst behavior too much power over my future. I'll think about Sunday dinner, I decided. No promises beyond that. Nathan nodded, respecting my cautious approach. That's all Mom's hoping for right now. One dinner at a time. As he left my office, I turned to the stack of reports requiring my attention, production metrics, client feedback, financial projections. The company continued its upward trajectory, each week bringing new evidence that the modernization strategy was working. But alongside professional satisfaction, I found myself contemplating the possibility of personal evolution as well. The family dynamics that had shaped me, often through resistance rather than emulation, didn't have to remain static. Just as Mitchell Manufacturing was finding a new identity that honored its heritage while embracing innovation, perhaps the Mitchell family could discover a healthier pattern of interaction. Not erasing the past or pretending the wounds hadn't occurred, but building something new that acknowledged both the damage done and the connections that remained worth preserving. I opened my calendar and blocked out Sunday evening. One dinner. One step forward on a path that remained uncertain but held possibilities I hadn't considered when I'd walked away from that company picnic months earlier, publicly humiliated but privately resolved to create something better than what I was leaving behind. The transformation of Mitchell Manufacturing had begun as a business necessity. The transformation of the Mitchell family relationship might prove equally valuable in its own way. Not because I needed my father's approval anymore, but because I deserved the freedom to define that relationship on new terms that supported my continued growth rather than limiting it. Professional revolution first, personal evolution now. Both essential components of moving forward with purpose rather than remaining defined by resistance to the past. Sunday dinner became a tentative new tradition over the next few weeks. The first evening was much like the birthday gathering, conversations careful and measured, topics safely confined to company developments, Nathan's client outreach efforts, and my mother's community activities. My father remained reserved but engaged, asking questions rather than issuing pronouncements, a subtle shift that continued to surprise me. By the third Sunday, something resembling normal family interaction had begun to emerge. Not the strained dynamics of my youth, with its constant undercurrent of judgment and need for approval, but something more balanced. We discussed business, local politics, books my mother had read in her book club. My father even shared stories from his early days at the company that I'd never heard before. Moments of uncertainty and challenge that humanized the infallible patriarch I'd grown up with. "The summer of '85 nearly broke us," he recalled over dessert one evening. 3 major clients canceled orders within a month. Cash reserves down to almost nothing. "I didn't know that," Nathan said, genuinely interested. Our father had never discussed company vulnerabilities with us when we were growing up, presenting only an image of consistent success and wise leadership. "Your grandfather had just handed over operational control," my father continued. "I was determined not to fail on my watch. Worked 20-hour days, personally called every client we had, secured enough bridge orders to keep the doors open." "What was the core problem?" I asked, professionally curious about this historical crisis I'd never been aware of. "Quality slippage during the transition," he admitted. I'd implemented some efficiency measures without fully understanding their impact on precision. Had to roll them back, rebuild trust with skeptical customers. The frank acknowledgement of his mistake startled me. Richard Mitchell acknowledging error was unprecedented in my experience. "How did you recover their confidence?" I pressed, sensing a valuable lesson in his experience. "Transparency, direct engagement." He met my gaze across the table. "I invited their engineers to observe our entire production process, showed them exactly how we were addressing the issues, then personally inspected every shipment for 6 months." I nodded, recognizing parallels to our current innovation workshops and heightened client engagement strategies. Trust through demonstration rather than assertion. Exactly. He seemed pleased by my understanding. Words are cheap. Proof is what matters in manufacturing. These glimpses into his earlier leadership, before rigidity and resistance to change had calcified his approach, helped me understand how he had built Mitchell Manufacturing into a respected industry presence. The insights were professionally valuable, but the gradual humanizing of my father held personal significance beyond business lessons. As summer transitioned to fall, the personal evolution paralleled the company's continued transformation. Mitchell Manufacturing secured 3 major new contracts, expanded the Innovation Workshop program to include quarterly industry forums, and began developing proprietary components that promised to establish new revenue streams beyond traditional manufacturing services. The board formally approved my permanent appointment as CEO, removing the interim designation that had technically remained in place during the transition period. The vote was unanimous, including Harold Bennett, who had maintained connection with my father throughout the process. Richard abstained from voting, Harold informed me privately after the meeting. But he told me beforehand that he wouldn't oppose the confirmation, said you'd earned the position on merit. Coming from my father, this represented profound acknowledgement. He had built his identity around being Mitchell Manufacturing's indispensable leader. Accepting my legitimate claim to that role indicated significant personal growth. The official announcement generated industry attention, with several trade publications requesting interviews about the company's dramatic turnaround. I approached these carefully, emphasizing the collaborative nature of the transformation rather than portraying it as a power struggle between generations. When asked directly about taking over from my father, I consistently focused on evolving market demands rather than personal conflict. Mitchell Manufacturing needed to adapt to changing industry requirements became my standard response. Every company reaches inflection points where new approaches are necessary. Our leadership transition aligned with that natural evolution. This measured messaging reflected my professional judgment about what best served the company's interests. But it also represented personal growth, the ability to discuss a painful family rupture without either minimizing the harm done or allowing it to define everything that followed. My father noticed this approach. During a Sunday dinner in late September, he mentioned seeing one of the interviews in an industry publication. "You were generous," he observed quietly, "about the transition." "It was the truth," I replied. "The company needed change. The public doesn't need all the personal details." He nodded slowly. "Still, You could have been more pointed, would have been justified. What purpose would that serve? I asked. The company is thriving. That's what matters professionally. And personally? He asked, surprising me with the direct inquiry about something beyond business metrics. I considered my answer carefully. Personally, I've found that defining success by my own standards rather than in opposition to someone else's is more sustainable. My father absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. Wisdom that took me far longer to approach, he finally said. If I ever truly have. It was the most direct acknowledgement yet of his own growth process, an admission that his rigid self-certainty had perhaps limited his development. Not quite an apology for the years of dismissing my perspectives and contributions, but recognition that his approach had been flawed. As the conversation moved to other topics, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically our relationship had evolved since that humiliating moment at the company picnic. The public dismissal that had seemed like an ending had actually initiated a profound transformation, not just of Mitchell Manufacturing, but of the Mitchell family itself. The next significant development came unexpectedly in mid-October. A prominent industry conference invited me to deliver a keynote address on manufacturing innovation in traditional industries. The organizers specifically requested that I address how established companies could modernize while preserving valuable institutional knowledge, precisely the balance Mitchell Manufacturing had achieved. The invitation represented professional recognition beyond local circles. This was a national platform, an opportunity to establish both personal credibility and company visibility in broader markets. I accepted immediately, already envisioning how we could leverage the exposure to accelerate business development efforts. Nathan was equally enthusiastic when I shared the news. Perfect timing, he noted during our strategy meeting. We've got concrete results to showcase now, not just plans and projections. The engineering forum last week generated serious interest from aerospace suppliers. This could help convert that interest to contracts. We should develop a comprehensive media strategy around it, I agreed. Case studies, client testimonials, site visits for serious prospects. I'll coordinate with marketing, Nathan offered. We can prepare materials that align with your presentation themes without being overtly promotional. We were deep in planning when my assistant interrupted with an unexpected message. Your father is here. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. Nathan and I exchanged surprised glances. Since his factory tour, my father had maintained careful boundaries around the company, never appearing unannounced or attempting to insert himself into operations. Send him in, I decided, curious about what would prompt this break from his established pattern. My father entered with measured steps, his expression unreadable. He carried a worn leather portfolio, one I recognized from his days as CEO, where he had kept what he called his essential documents. Olivia, Nathan. He nodded to each of us. Sorry to interrupt. I've just come from lunch with Harold Bennett. Is everything all right? I asked, noting a certain tension in his posture. Fine, better than fine. He placed the portfolio on the conference table. Harold mentioned your upcoming keynote at the Edison conference. News travels fast, I observed. The invitation had only arrived yesterday. Industry circles are small, my father agreed, particularly at Harold's level. The old guard keeps tabs on everything significant. He unzipped the portfolio and removed a stack of folders, each labeled with neat block printing. I thought these might be useful as you prepare your presentation. Curious, I accepted the folders and opened the top one. Inside were handwritten notes, technical diagrams, and meeting minutes dating back to the mid-1980s, the period when my father had taken over leadership from my grandfather. These are your transition notes, I realized, scanning the meticulous documentation of challenges, decisions, and outcomes during that earlier leadership change. My first 2 years as CEO, he confirmed. the complete record, unfiltered, including the mistakes and false starts, not the sanitized version that went into company history. I looked up, surprised by the gesture. These personal records represented a side of my father I'd never been permitted to see. The uncertain new leader finding his way, making errors, learning through trial and experience rather than operating with the infallible authority he had. Always projected. "Why are you sharing these now?" I asked directly. "Because they're relevant to your keynote topic," he replied. "Managing transition while preserving institutional knowledge. I faced similar challenges, albeit in a different market environment." I flipped through more pages, finding candid assessments of failed initiatives, documentation of resistance from old guard managers, strategies for introducing new methods without alienating experienced craftsmen. The parallel to my own experience was striking, despite the decades separating our transitions. "This is extraordinarily helpful," I acknowledged, "especially your notes on balancing efficiency improvements with quality maintenance. We've been addressing similar tensions." My father nodded. "Some challenges are perennial in manufacturing. The specifics change, but the fundamental balancing acts remain." Nathan had been examining another folder. "You documented everything in remarkable detail. I had no idea you kept such comprehensive records." "A habit from my engineering training," our father explained. "Process documentation matters as much as the outcome. You can't reproduce success or avoid repeating failure without understanding the path that led there." It was precisely the philosophy that had guided my implementation of the modernization plan: methodical documentation, analysis of outcomes, continuous refinement based on results. I had assumed this approach came from my engineering education, never considering it might be an inherited trait from the father who had seemed so resistant to systematic improvement. "There's more," my father continued, gesturing to the stack of folders. "The mid-90s recession response, the early attempts at automation, some successful, others disastrous. The offshore competition challenge of the early 2000s. Each folder contained his contemporaneous documentation of critical periods in the company's evolution, not the official reports that had gone to the board or shareholders, but his unvarnished assessments, complete with doubts, miscalculations, and the reasoning behind difficult decisions. "This is a treasure trove," I said with genuine appreciation. "The kind of institutional knowledge that rarely gets preserved through leadership transitions." "That was my thought," he agreed. "Whatever our personal differences, the company deserves the benefit of its full history, including the parts that never made it into official records." The gesture represented something profound. Not just practical assistance with my upcoming presentation, but acknowledgement that I was now the rightful steward of Mitchell Manufacturing's legacy. By sharing these private records, my father was formally passing the torch in a way that his forced departure had not permitted. "Thank you," I said simply. "I'll use these well." He nodded once, his mission accomplished. "I should let you get back to your meeting. My apologies for the interruption." As he turned to leave, I made a spontaneous decision. "Would you be interested in reviewing my draft presentation once it's ready? Your perspective on how these historical challenges connect to our current approach could be valuable." The invitation clearly surprised him. He paused, considering, then nodded. "I'd be honored. Just let me know when." After he departed, Nathan looked at me with raised eyebrows. "That was unexpected." "In more ways than one," I agreed, still processing the significance of what had just occurred. "These notes reveal a very different Richard Mitchell than the one we grew up with. The one who could admit uncertainty, who documented his mistakes for future learning?" Nathan smiled slightly. "That version definitely didn't make appearances at our dinner table." I nodded, thumbing through more pages of my father's meticulous handwriting. "It makes me wonder what happened between these Thoughtful analyses and the rigid, change-resistant leader he became. Success, probably, Nathan suggested. Being right enough times that he started to believe he couldn't be wrong. Having people defer to his judgment until he stopped questioning it himself. It was an insightful observation, and a cautionary tale for any leader, including me. Success could breed complacency as easily as failure bred innovation. My father's journey from thoughtful young CEO to change-resistant patriarch hadn't happened overnight, but through gradual reinforcement of what worked in one era, without recognition that conditions would inevitably evolve. We should digitize these, I decided, carefully returning the documents to their folders. Create a proper company archive that preserves this kind of institutional knowledge while making it accessible to future leadership. Nathan agreed. Part of honoring the legacy while building for the future. The phrase captured perfectly the balance we were striving for, both in the company and increasingly in our family relationships. Honoring what deserved preservation while creating space for necessary evolution. Over the next 2 weeks, I immersed myself in preparing for the keynote address, mining my father's historical records for insights and patterns that connected to our current transformation. The resulting presentation took shape as a compelling narrative about industrial evolution. Not the replacement of tradition with technology, but their thoughtful integration to create sustainable manufacturing models in a changing marketplace. True to my spontaneous invitation, I sent the draft to my father for review. His response came within 48 hours, detailed, substantive feedback that strengthened the historical sections while respecting my overall vision and conclusions. Not the controlling criticism I might once have expected, but collaborative input that added value without attempting to dominate. The conference itself, held in Chicago's renovated manufacturing district, drew industry leaders from across the country. My keynote slot on the second morning placed me immediately before a networking lunch, an advantageous position for continuing conversations sparked by the presentation. Standing backstage as the introduction began, I felt a momentary flutter of nerves, not performance anxiety, but awareness of the significance of this moment for Mitchell Manufacturing's reputation and future prospects. The company's remarkable turnaround was about to be showcased on a national stage, with potential clients and industry influencers in attendance. As I stepped onto the platform to polite applause, I saw Nathan in the front row, giving me an encouraging nod. Beside him, to my complete surprise, sat my father, wearing a Mitchell Manufacturing polo shirt with our newly redesigned logo. His presence had not been mentioned in any of our recent conversations, making his appearance entirely unexpected. The significance wasn't lost on me. By attending publicly, dressed in company attire, he was visibly endorsing both the new direction and my leadership. For conference attendees familiar with industry circles, his presence would register as deliberate reconciliation rather than obligatory appearance. I launched into my presentation with renewed confidence, walking the audience through Mitchell Manufacturing's evolution, from my grandfather's founding principles through my father's stewardship to the current transformation. Using insights from his private notes, I illustrated how each generation had faced distinct challenges while maintaining core values of quality, craftsmanship, and innovation. The question isn't whether to honor tradition or embrace innovation, I concluded. It's how to do both simultaneously, preserving what remains valuable while evolving what needs to change. At Mitchell Manufacturing, we've discovered that the most sustainable path forward includes both historical wisdom and technological advancement, not as competing forces, but as complementary strengths. The applause that followed was gratifying, but the real measure of success came during the subsequent networking lunch, where Nathan and I found ourselves surrounded by industry peers eager to discuss potential collaborations, site visits, and partnership opportunities. My father maintained a deliberate distance during these professional conversations, neither inserting himself nor appearing disconnected. He engaged when approached directly, but otherwise allowed the next generation of leadership to take center, stage, another indication of his evolving perspective on his role within the company ecosystem. When the formal networking concluded, he joined Nathan and me at a corner table with coffee. "Impressive presentation," he offered, his tone genuinely approving rather than grudgingly accepting. "Particularly the connection between our early quality crisis and the current emphasis on transparency in modernization." "Your notes made that connection possible," I acknowledged. "The historical context adds credibility to our current approach." "The approach stands on its own merits," he countered. "The results speak for themselves." 4 reporters asked me for comments on the company's transformation. "What did you tell them?" Nathan asked, curious about how our father would position himself in relation to the changes. "That Mitchell Manufacturing is fulfilling its founding purpose, delivering precision components that meet evolving market needs under leadership well-equipped for current challenges." He met my gaze directly. "That innovation has always been part of our DNA, even when temporarily overlooked." It was a generous framing that acknowledged the necessity of change without portraying himself as an obstacle that had to be removed. More importantly, it positioned the company's evolution as continuous rather than discontinuous, supporting our external messaging about honoring legacy while embracing innovation. "Thank you for coming," I said, recognizing the significance of his presence. "It matters to have the company's history visibly connected to its future." He nodded, understanding the professional importance of his attendance. But his next words surprised me with their personal dimension. "It matters to me as well," he admitted quietly. "To see what you've built, what you're still building." The acknowledgement wasn't effusive or emotional. Richard Mitchell would likely never be comfortable with overt sentiment, but it represented profound recognition of my accomplishments on my own terms, not merely as his daughter or as a Mitchell, but as a leader in my own right. The conference generated immediate tangible results for Mitchell Manufacturing. 3 significant prospects scheduled facility tours within the following week. 2 industry publications requested extended interviews about our modernization process. A prominent business school professor asked permission to develop a case study about our successful transition. Beyond these external validations, the event marked another milestone in the evolving Mitchell family dynamic. My father's public appearance alongside Nathan and me sent a clear message within industry circles that the leadership transition, however it might have begun, now had his blessing. This perception helped neutralize lingering questions about company stability that competitors had occasionally tried to exploit. More personally, his presence represented another step in our gradual reconciliation. Not a complete healing of old wounds, but continuing evidence that both of us were capable of growth beyond the painful patterns that had defined our relationship for decades. The weeks following the conference brought accelerated business development activity. Nathan expertly converted initial interest into serious discussions, leveraging the enhanced credibility from the keynote and subsequent media coverage. By month's end, Mitchell Manufacturing had secured 2 major contracts that would require expanding production capacity beyond our original modernization plans. This welcome challenge necessitated revisiting our capital investment strategy. The anticipated timeline for full return on the initial modernization had been 3 years. These new opportunities could potentially accelerate that to 18 months, justifying additional equipment purchases and facility upgrades. I convened a special executive committee meeting to evaluate options, including Frank Russo, Martin, Chen, Nathan, and 2 board representatives. After reviewing financial projections and market analysis, consensus emerged around an aggressive expansion plan that would position us to capture emerging opportunities in aerospace and medical device manufacturing. "The financial case is solid," Frank confirmed, his initial skepticism about modernization long since replaced by data-driven support. With the secured contracts as foundation, the additional investment carries manageable risk with substantial upside potential. Engineering and operations can manage the expansion without compromising existing commitments, Martin added. The modernized production system was designed with scalability in mind. The executive team's unified support reflected how thoroughly the company culture had evolved in the months since my takeover. The reflexive resistance to change that had characterized my father's final years had given way to evidence-based decision-making and collaborative problem-solving. We'll need board approval for the capital expenditure, I noted, turning to the board representatives. What's your assessment of how that discussion will go? Harold Bennett, representing the board's finance committee, smiled slightly. After the quarterly results and the conference visibility, I don't anticipate significant opposition. The numbers speak for themselves. Prepare the formal proposal for next week's meeting, I decided. Let's move quickly while maintaining thoroughness. These market opportunities won't wait indefinitely. As the meeting concluded, Harold lingered behind, waiting until the others had departed before addressing me privately. There's something else you should know, he said, his expression careful. I had lunch with your father yesterday. He's been thinking about his Mitchell manufacturing shares. My attention sharpened immediately. Despite the leadership transition and improving personal relationship, my father had maintained his ownership stake in the company, a significant minority position that, while not controlling, represented substantial financial value and symbolic connection. What about them? I asked neutrally, uncertain whether this development represented potential complication or opportunity. He's considering options, Harold replied, including transferring a portion to you and Nathan directly, rather than through eventual inheritance. The information surprised me. Such a transfer would constitute formal recognition of our leadership beyond his public appearances or verbal support. It would represent tangible acknowledgement of our rightful place in the company's ownership structure, not merely its operational leadership. Did he explain his thinking? I pressed, curious about the motivation behind this potential shift. Harold nodded. He mentioned tax considerations, estate planning, the usual financial justifications. But between us, I think he's seeking tangible ways to demonstrate his support for the direction you're taking the company. The insight aligned with my father's recent behavior, his presence at the conference, his sharing of historical records, his gradually increasing engagement with the transformed company. Each step represented movement away from the bitter rejection that had characterized the immediate aftermath of his removal. Has he discussed this with Nathan? I asked. Not yet, Harold confirmed. He wanted my assessment of the financial implications first, but I expect he'll raise it directly with both of you soon, perhaps at one of your Sunday dinners. I thanked Harold for the advance notice, appreciating the opportunity to consider this development before my father broached the subject formally. The potential share transfer represented another evolution in our complex relationship, a concrete acknowledgement that Mitchell Manufacturing's future belonged rightfully to the next generation. Sure enough, that Sunday's dinner included a carefully orchestrated moment when my father invited Nathan and me to join him in his home office after the meal. My mother exchanged a knowing glance with him as we left the dining room, confirming that she was aware of whatever he planned to discuss. His office remained much as I remembered from childhood visits to the lake house. Bookshelves lined with manufacturing references and business biographies, a few carefully selected family photographs, his engineering diplomas displayed on one wall. The space radiated ordered precision, much like the man himself. Please sit, he invited, gesturing to the leather chairs arranged near his desk. He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back in what I recognized as his characteristic posture when making formal announcements. I've been giving considerable thought to my Mitchell manufacturing holdings, he began without preamble. As you know, I retained my ownership stake when operational control transferred. Nathan and I nodded, maintaining neutral expressions despite Harold's advance warning about this conversation's likely direction. Initially, I held those shares out of, well, let's call it reluctance to sever all connection with the company I'd led for 3 decades. My father's candor about his emotional motivation was another indication of his ongoing personal evolution. But as months have passed, I've recognized that passive ownership without contribution isn't the right approach for anyone involved. He moved to his desk and retrieved a folder containing what appeared to be legal documents. I've instructed my attorneys to prepare paperwork transferring 30% of my holdings to each of you, effective immediately. The remaining 40% will transfer gradually over the next 5 years to minimize tax implications. The magnitude of the gesture exceeded what Harold had implied. This wasn't a token share transfer, but substantial redistribution of ownership, AI. Concrete acknowledgement of our legitimate stake in the company's future. That's significant, Dad, Nathan said carefully. Are you certain this is what you want? My father nodded decisively. The company is thriving under your leadership. The ownership structure should reflect operational reality. He met my gaze directly. The shares are yours by right of what you've built, not merely by inheritance. The explicit acknowledgement of earned ownership rather than granted privilege represented profound recognition from a man who had once publicly declared me worthless. The contrast between that humiliating moment at the company picnic and this deliberate acknowledgement of my rightful place in Mitchell Manufacturing's ownership structure could hardly have been more stark. Thank you, I said simply, accepting both the material value of the shares and the deeper significance of the gesture. This means a great deal. It's the right structure for the company's continued success, my father replied, his tone matter of fact, but not dismissive. And it's overdue recognition of what you've both contributed. He passed us each a copy of the transfer documents, already signed and notarized. Review these with your own attorneys, of course. But the terms are straightforward. Immediate transfer with full voting rights and proportional dividend participation. The remainder of the conversation covered technical details of the ownership transition, tax considerations, reporting requirements, coordination with existing shareholder agreements. Throughout, my father maintained the demeanor of a businessman completing a necessary transaction rather than a father making amends. Yet beneath the professional exterior, the significance of his action was unmistakable. By voluntarily transferring substantial ownership during his lifetime rather than through eventual inheritance, he was formally acknowledging that Mitchell Manufacturing's future belonged to the next generation. Not as a gift granted by his generosity, but as recognition of demonstrated capability and earned leadership. As we concluded the discussion and prepared to rejoin my mother in the living room, my father paused, his hand on the office door. There's one more thing, he said, his tone shifting slightly. A personal note. Nathan and I waited expectantly, sensing that whatever followed would differ from the business-like discussion that had preceded it. I've had considerable time for reflection these past months, my father continued, his gaze directed at the family photographs on his bookshelf rather than at either of us directly. About leadership, about family, about mistakes made. The uncharacteristic hesitation in his typically confident delivery signaled the difficulty of whatever he was attempting to express. The company picnic, he said finally, naming the event that had precipitated our professional separation and family rupture. What I said that day, how I said it was inexcusable. The direct acknowledgement of that painful moment caught me by surprise. We had gradually rebuilt a working relationship without explicitly addressing the public humiliation that had triggered the company takeover. This voluntary reference to that day represented another significant step in our evolving dynamic. I was wrong, my father continued, the words clearly difficult for a man who had built his identity around being right. Not just tactically wrong in how I handled the situation, but fundamentally wrong in my assessment. He turned to face me directly, his expression more open than I could recall seeing since early childhood. You were never worthless, Olivia. You are exceptionally valuable. I failed to see it because I was looking for a mirror image of myself rather than recognizing your unique strengths. The simple acknowledgement released something I hadn't realized I was still carrying, not a need for his approval, which I had. Outgrown through the process of reclaiming and transforming Mitchell Manufacturing, but perhaps a lingering question about whether he truly recognized the harm he had caused. "Thank you for saying that," I replied quietly. "It matters to hear it directly." He nodded once, understanding the significance of explicit acknowledgement rather than merely implied recognition through changed behavior. It needed to be said. Should have been said much sooner. With that, he opened the door, signaling the end of this unexpectedly personal moment. As we rejoined my mother in the living room, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: community events, an upcoming charity function, Nathan's recent fishing trip. But something fundamental had shifted. Yet again in the Mitchell family dynamic. The share transfer represented formal recognition of our professional place in the company's structure. My father's direct acknowledgement of his wrongdoing addressed the personal wound that had precipitated our separation. Neither action erased the past or guaranteed a perfect future relationship. But together, they created space for something new to develop, a family connection based on mutual respect and recognition rather than dominance and defiance. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the remarkable journey from that humiliating moment at the company picnic to this voluntary acknowledgement of my rightful place in both Mitchell Manufacturing and the Mitchell family. The transformation had not followed a linear path, nor had it concluded with a tidy resolution of all tensions and differences. Instead, it represented ongoing evolution, professional success that validated my vision for the company, personal growth that freed me from defining myself in opposition to my father, and family reconciliation based on changed behavior rather than mere words. The company continued to thrive under the modernization strategy, adapting to market demands while preserving valuable traditions. The Mitchell family continued its parallel transformation, finding new patterns of interaction that acknowledged past wounds while creating space for healthier connection. Neither process was complete or perfect. Both would require ongoing attention and intentional effort. But the foundation had been established for sustainable success in both domains, professional and personal, corporate and familial. The father, who had once publicly called me worthless, had voluntarily acknowledged my value through both concrete action and direct statement. Not because I still needed his validation, but because he had grown enough to recognize reality on its own terms, rather than through the distorting lens of his own expectations. That growth represented perhaps the most meaningful transformation of all, not just of Mitchell Manufacturing or the Mitchell family structure, but of the individuals involved. My father finding humility alongside his natural confidence. Nathan, discovering his unique strengths beyond his prescribed role as heir apparent. My mother developing a voice independent of her husband's pronouncements. And me, growing beyond both desperate seeking of approval and reactive rejection of authority to establish leadership based on vision, competence, and collaborative strength. No longer defined by resistance to my father's expectations, but by my own standards of excellence and purpose. The company takeover that had begun as necessary response to public humiliation had evolved into something far more significant than mere reversal of power dynamics. It had catalyzed growth for everyone involved, painful at times, challenging throughout, but ultimately transformative in ways none of us could have anticipated when my father stood before the company gathering and declared me worthless. Sometimes the deepest wounds create the most profound opportunities for growth, not because suffering itself has value, but because responding to injury with purpose rather than mere reaction can open unexpected paths forward. The Mitchell legacy, both corporate and familial, would continue to evolve through challenge and change, carrying forward what deserved preservation while continually creating space for necessary innovation. Not the ending of a story, but the ongoing development of interconnected narratives, company and family, professional and personal, past and future, each informing the others in a continuous process of growth, adaptation, and renewal. 6 months. After the share transfer, Mitchell Manufacturing celebrated its 75th anniversary. The milestone offered natural opportunity to reflect on the company's evolution through 3 generations of leadership, from my grandfather's founding, vision through my father's stewardship to the current transformation under my direction. Rather than hosting a traditional corporate gala, we designed a community-centered celebration that highlighted the interconnection between the company and Lakewood. The main production facility opened its doors for public tours, showcasing both historical artifacts and cutting-edge technology. Local schools participated in engineering demonstrations and hands-on workshops. Long-serving employees shared stories that captured the human dimension of manufacturing work beyond technical processes. The culminating event featured an outdoor dinner for employees, retirees, and their families. Nearly 1,000 people gathered under white tents on the grounds where the company had stood for 7 decades. The atmosphere blended celebration with recognition, honoring both heritage and innovation. As CEO, I delivered remarks that acknowledged all who had contributed to Mitchell Manufacturing's longevity and success. My father sat at a prominent table near the front, not at the center of attention but visibly present and engaged. When I invited him to join me briefly on stage, spontaneous applause broke out among the longer-serving employees who remembered his contributions during more successful periods of his leadership. Mitchell Manufacturing was built on principles that transcend any individual leader, I noted as he stood beside me. Quality, integrity, craftsmanship, innovation. These values have guided this company through economic cycles, technological revolutions, and changing market demands. My father nodded in agreement, then added his own brief reflections. Watching this company evolve under new leadership has been one of the great privileges of my life, he stated, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. The ability to honor tradition while embracing necessary change ensures Mitchell Manufacturing will thrive for generations to come. The gracious acknowledgement, delivered publicly before employees who had witnessed our difficult transition, represented remarkable growth from the man who had once declared me worthless at a company function. Not erasure of that painful history, but evidence that new patterns could be established, that growth remained possible even after decades of entrenched behavior. After the formal program concluded, I circulated among the tables, connecting with employees from every department and era of the company's history. Jim Collins from the Legacy line introduced me to his newest apprentice, a young woman studying mechanical engineering who worked part-time while completing her degree. Dave Mercer proudly demonstrated how the ergonomic modifications he'd helped design had reduced strain injuries across all production areas. These personal connections represented the most satisfying dimension of the company's transformation. Beyond financial metrics and production statistics, Mitchell Manufacturing had become a place where people felt genuinely invested in both preserving valuable traditions and creating sustainable innovations. Toward the evening's end, as the celebration transitioned to music and dancing under the stars, my father approached where I stood observing the festivities. "You've created something remarkable here," he said quietly. "Not just improved business performance, but a renewed sense of purpose." "We've created it," I corrected gently. The foundation was solid. It just needed adaptation to changing conditions. He nodded, accepting the generous framing. The speech tonight, inviting me to participate, that couldn't have been easy after everything. "It felt right," I replied simply. "Your contributions to this company's history are significant, whatever difficulties preceded the transition. Pretending otherwise would dishonor the very legacy we're celebrating." Still, he gazed out at the gathering, multiple generations of employees and their families enjoying the celebration. Your capacity for perspective exceeds mine. At your age, perhaps at any age. The acknowledgement wasn't delivered with emotional flourish, but its sincerity was unmistakable. Richard Mitchell offering unqualified recognition of another's superior qualities represented profound personal evolution. We all have different strengths, I offered. Your determination built this company's reputation. Nathan's relationship skills maintain critical client connections. My engineering perspective helps navigate technological change. No single approach would be sufficient alone. My father considered this, then asked a question I hadn't anticipated. If you could go back to before the company picnic, before things deteriorated so badly, what would you have done differently? The query invited reflection on the painful path that had led to our current reality. I considered carefully before responding. I'm not sure a different approach would have yielded better results, I admitted. We were at an impasse that required decisive action. The company needed transformation that you weren't prepared to implement. The confrontation was probably inevitable. He nodded slowly, accepting this assessment. And personally, would you have preferred a less public break? Of course, I acknowledged. The public humiliation was unnecessary and harmful, but it also catalyzed action that might have been delayed otherwise. Sometimes clear breaks create space for new beginnings in ways that gradual transitions don't. My father absorbed this perspective, his expression thoughtful. I regret the manner of it, he said finally. Not the outcome. The company is thriving, under your leadership, but the pain caused along the way. It was the most direct apology he had yet offered for that pivotal moment of public rejection. Not elaborate or emotional, but genuine acknowledgement of harm done regardless of ultimate outcomes. Thank you for saying that, I replied. It matters to have it recognized directly. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the celebration continue around us. A visual representation of the company's successful evolution from troubled traditional manufacturer to innovative industry leader. Your grandfather would be proud, my father said quietly, of what you've built here, of how you've carried the Mitchell legacy forward. The comment might once have felt like begrudging acknowledgement from a man who had consistently withheld approval. Now it registered as simple truth-telling from someone who had earned the right to offer perspective through his own growth and changing relationship to the company we both cared about. I think he would be proud of all of us, I suggested, for finding our way through difficult transition to something sustainable, for preserving what matters while changing what needed to change. My father nodded, accepting this more inclusive framing. As a young employee approached with a question about an historical display, he stepped aside with a slight smile, allowing me to attend to my CEO responsibilities while he moved among the retirees who remembered his leadership era. The 75th anniversary celebration marked a significant milestone in Mitchell Manufacturing's evolution. But perhaps more meaningfully, it represented a milestone in the parallel transformation of the Mitchell family, from rigid hierarchy defined by power and control to more balanced connection based on recognition of diverse contributions. The months that followed brought continued growth on both fronts. The company secured its largest contract to date, a 5-year agreement to supply precision components for a next-generation medical device with global distribution. The board approved expansion into a second production facility to accommodate increasing demand. Industry publications featured Mitchell Manufacturing as a case study in successful modernization of traditional manufacturing businesses. On the IDOT, personal front family Sunday dinners evolved from tentative, careful interactions to more genuine connection. My father continued his gradual transition from authoritarian patriarch to engaged family member with valuable perspective, but without controlling authority. My mother found her own voice in family discussions rather than simply echoing her husband's positions. Nathan and I developed a sibling relationship based on mutual respect and complementary strengths rather than the competition our father had once encouraged. None of these transformations erased the painful history that preceded them. The wound of public rejection at the company picnic remained part of our shared narrative, acknowledged rather than denied, but no longer defining every interaction. Like the company itself, the Mitchell family had found ways to honor its history, while creating space for necessary evolution. 1 year to the day after that fateful company picnic where my father had publicly disowned me, Mitchell Manufacturing held its annual community gathering, reimagined as a celebration of partnership between the company and the town that had supported it for generations. Unlike the previous year's hierarchical formal affair, this event featured interactive displays showcasing both traditional craftsmanship and technological innovation. Employees from every department demonstrated their skills and contributions. Local technical school students presented projects developed in partnership with company mentors. The atmosphere blended professional showcase with community festival. As I circulated among the displays, I overheard a conversation between my father and a young engineer recently hired to support our expanding aerospace contracts. "What drew you to Mitchell?" my father asked, genuinely curious about her perspective as a newcomer. "The balance," she replied without hesitation. "Most places either cling to tradition at the expense of innovation or chase technology without respecting established expertise. Mitchell integrates both, valuing craftsmanship while embracing new methods." My father nodded, visibly pleased by her assessment. "That integration didn't happen by accident," he noted, glancing in my direction. "It required leadership with both technical vision and respect for institutional knowledge." The spontaneous acknowledgement, offered not to impress me but in genuine conversation with a new employee, demonstrated how thoroughly his perspective had evolved. The man who had once publicly declared me worthless now voluntarily recognized the value of my leadership approach to someone with no awareness of our difficult history. Later that evening, as the gathering transitioned to a more relaxed community dinner, Nathan joined me at a table overlooking the festivities. "Quite a difference from last year," he observed, gesturing toward where employees and their families shared meals in comfortable clusters rather than assigned seating. "In more ways than one," I agreed, watching my father engage in animated conversation with Jim Collins and several legacy-line craftspeople. No hint of the rigid authority that had once defined his interactions. "Who would have thought we'd end up here?" Nathan mused. "After that day, I mean. When he stopped, still reluctant to directly reference the painful public rejection that had triggered subsequent events. "When he disowned me in front of everyone," I finished for him, naming the reality without flinching. "It's okay to acknowledge it happened, Nathan. Pretending it didn't would deny the journey that followed." He nodded, accepting this framing. "It's just remarkable. The transformation. In the company, in him, in all of us, really. Sometimes catalysts come in unexpected and painful forms," I reflected. That moment forced changes that might never have happened otherwise, professionally and personally. We watched as my father excused himself from his conversation and made his way toward our table, moving with the relaxed confidence of someone comfortable in his surroundings, but no longer needing to command them. "The production demonstrations are impressive," he commented, as he joined us. "Particularly the integration between traditional quality inspection and the new digital verification system. Martin Chen's team deserves credit for that," I acknowledged. "They found ways to augment human expertise rather than replace it." "The Mitchell approach," my father noted with approving recognition. "Excellence through integration rather than elimination." The observation captured perfectly the philosophy that had guided our successful transformation, seeking synthesis between valuable traditions and necessary innovations rather than forcing choice between them. In both the company and family contexts, this approach had created space for evolution without wholesale rejection of the past. As the summer evening deepened toward dusk, Lanterns illuminated the gathering while conversation and laughter continued under star-filled skies. I found myself momentarily apart from the festivities, observing the scene from a small rise overlooking the grounds. My father approached, hands clasped behind his back in his characteristic posture, but his expression open rather than commanding. "A year ago today," he began, directly acknowledging the anniversary neither of us had explicitly mentioned, "I made the worst mistake of my professional life and my personal life." The candid assessment surprised me with its timing and directness. We had gradually rebuilt relationship without directly revisiting that painful moment, allowing changed behavior rather than explicit discussion to establish new patterns. "It was a difficult day," I agreed, neither minimizing the harm nor dwelling in resentment. "I've thought often about what drove that moment," he continued thoughtfully. "Beyond immediate frustrations or concerns about the company's direction, what would compel a father to publicly reject his daughter that way?" His willingness to examine his own motivations represented significant growth from the man who had once presented himself as beyond question or self-doubt. "Fear, I think," he concluded after a moment's reflection. "Fear that the world was changing in ways I couldn't control. Fear that my approach was becoming obsolete. Fear of being replaced rather than evolving." The insight demonstrated remarkable self-awareness from someone who had spent decades projecting invulnerable certainty, not excuse-making for inexcusable behavior, but genuine understanding of the human weaknesses that had contributed to a painful rupture. "Fear makes us react in ways we later regret," I acknowledged, recognizing the universal aspect of his experience without dismissing its specific impact. "The irony," my father continued, gazing out at the thriving company gathering, "is that embracing the very changes I resisted would have allowed me to evolve with dignity rather than being forced out through crisis. You tried to show me that path. I refused to see it." The admission that my perspective had been valid all along might once have felt like vindication I desperately needed. Now it registered simply as honest recognition between adults with different approaches and experiences. "We each have blind spots," I offered. "Mine included failing to recognize how threatening fundamental change can feel after decades of success with established methods." My father smiled slightly at this. Generous interpretation. Always the engineer, seeing systems and patterns rather than just individual failures. "It served me well in transforming manufacturing processes," I acknowledged. "Perhaps in understanding family dynamics too." He nodded thoughtfully. "The question that matters now isn't what went wrong then, but what we build going forward. The company has its answer." He gestured toward the celebration spreading across the grounds. "Mitchell Manufacturing has successfully integrated tradition and innovation under your leadership." "And the family?" I asked, curious about his perspective on our parallel personal evolution. "Finding its way," he replied carefully. "Learning new patterns after decades of old ones, not without missteps, but moving in promising directions." It was an accurate assessment of our gradual reconciliation, neither complete erasure of painful history nor permanent estrangement, but intentional creation of healthier connection based on changed behavior and growing mutual respect. "I'm grateful for that opportunity," my father added, the simple statement representing profound growth for someone who had rarely expressed gratitude or acknowledged needing second chances. As we rejoined the gathering, moving among employees, and families enjoying the community celebration, I reflected on the remarkable journey from public humiliation to tentative reconciliation. The company takeover that had begun as necessary response to my father's rejection had evolved into something far more significant, catalyst for transformation in both professional systems and personal relationships. Mitchell Manufacturing had found sustainable balance between honoring its heritage and embracing innovation, not through compromise that weakened both, but through integration that strengthened each. The Mitchell family was finding a similar balance, acknowledging its imperfect history while creating space for healthier patterns moving forward. The father who had once publicly declared me worthless now recognized my value, not because I still needed that validation, but because he had grown enough to see reality more clearly. The daughter who had once defined herself largely through resistance to paternal judgment now led confidently from her own center, neither seeking approval nor rejecting wisdom that deserved preservation. As I watched my father engage warmly with long-serving employees who had witnessed both his leadership era and the successful transition that followed, I appreciated the complexity of human growth and relationship evolution. Not simple stories of villains reformed or victims vindicated, but nuanced journeys of imperfect people finding better ways forward after painful missteps. The man who had kicked me out for being worthless still carried the capacity for both harm and growth, just as I did. The company I had purchased and transformed after his public rejection remained both shaped by its history and open to necessary evolution. Neither story had reached its conclusion. Both continued unfolding through daily choices and ongoing development. That complexity itself felt worthy of celebration. The recognition that human relationships, like manufacturing processes, require both preservation of what works and courageous change where needed. Mitchell Manufacturing had found that balance under my leadership. The Mitchell family was finding it through our collective willingness to grow beyond painful patterns while honoring connections worth preserving. Sometimes the deepest wounds create the most profound opportunities for transformation. Not because suffering itself has value, but because responding to injury with purpose rather than mere reaction opens unexpected paths toward both professional success and personal growth. The journey continues for both Mitchell Manufacturing and the Mitchell family, each day bringing new opportunities to honor valuable heritage while creating space for necessary evolution. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.